A suspicious millionaire, wary of the sudden fear that has gripped his three daughters, decides to disguise himself as a gardener to uncover the truth. In the silence of the mansion, he catches his new wife displaying a calculated cruelty whenever she believes she is not being watched. But everything changes when the housemaid confronts the stepmother to protect the girls, risking her own job. Stunned behind the window, the father realizes that this simple woman is the only barrier between his daughters, and a danger far greater than he had imagined. Richard Sterling watched the rain beat against the enormous glass windows of the living room, his hands trembling imperceptibly as he held a cup of coffee that had gone cold minutes ago. The view of the Hudson Valley Mountains, normally comforting with its lush green and romantic mist, now seemed like a nebulous prison hiding secrets he could not yet name. 2 years ago, this same room had witnessed his profound grief over the loss of Eleanor, his first wife, his companion of 15 years. Now, ironically, this same space held a different kind of pain, more subtle yet equally devastating. The laughter that used to echo through the corridors of the imposing estate had vanished. Richard tried to remember the last time he had heard Sophia, Isabel, and Amelia laugh in that spontaneous, crystal-clear way that had always warmed his heart. The 3 6-year-old girls, inseparable triplets since they came into the world, now barely looked at each other during meals. Where there was once complicity and whispered games, a disturbing silence now reigned, making every dinner feel like a wake. He placed the cup on the mahogany table with more force than he intended, the sound echoing through the empty room. His company, the Sterling luxury hotel chain, was thriving as never before. The numbers from the last quarter were impressive. 3 new properties were in the final stages of construction on the South Carolina coast, and international investors were vying for meetings with him. But what importance did all that success have if his daughters were fading away before his very eyes? Victoria appeared at the top of the main staircase, impeccable as always in a beige linen dress that cost more than many Americans earn in a year. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled in an elegant chignon, and the smile she offered her husband was warm and seemingly genuine. Richard forced a smile in return, feeling that familiar discomfort growing in his stomach. He had met Victoria almost 3 years ago at a charity event at the Plaza Hotel. She had been stunning that night, fluently discussing contemporary art with a group of European collectors. She had seemed like the perfect woman, sophisticated enough for his world, but with an apparent genuine interest in the girls. During their courtship, Victoria had been attentive to Sophia, Isabel, and Amelia. She brought creative gifts, participated in their games, and listened patiently to their childhood stories. The girls, still processing the absence of their biological mother, seemed to open up gradually to this new female presence. Richard had convinced himself that he was making the right choice, giving his daughters the mother figure they so desperately needed. The wedding had taken place 8 months ago, a discreet but elegant ceremony in the gardens of the estate itself, with only close family and intimate friends. The problems began subtly. First, there were small changes in the girls' routine. Victoria insisted they needed more discipline, more structure. Schedules became rigid, rules multiplied. When Richard questioned it, she argued, with seemingly irrefutable logic, that children needed clear boundaries, especially after losing their mother so young. He had relented, trusting her experience. After all, Victoria came from a traditional Boston family where formal education was valued above all else. But then the changes became more visible. Sophia, the most talkative of the 3, began to stutter. Isabel, always curious and inquisitive, started answering questions only with monosyllables. Amelia, the most sensitive, developed a nervous tic of biting her lips until they bled. The doctors they consulted found no physical causes, attributing everything to the stress of delayed grief, suggesting time and patience. Richard was no fool. He had observed the changes coinciding precisely with his business trips. Every time he returned from New York, Chicago, or the developments in South Carolina, he found the girls more withdrawn, paler, more absent. He had tried to talk to them, but something prevented them from speaking freely. Their little eyes would shift away, their voices would become even quieter, and eventually they would just shake their heads, and run to their rooms. The housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, who had worked with the Sterling family for over 20 years and had practically raised Richard himself, when his own mother passed away in his youth, also seemed different. The woman in her 60s, always cheerful and maternal, now walked through the house with a perpetually worried expression etched on her face. When Richard tried to talk about the girls, Mrs. Gable chose her words with excessive care, vaguely praising Victoria's efforts to establish routines, but her eyes told a different story. There was also Clara, one of the more recent maids, hired about a year ago. She was a young woman, perhaps 28, from upstate New York. Despite her humble position in the household hierarchy, there was something remarkable about Clara. She possessed a natural dignity, a genuine kindness that the girls instinctively sensed. Richard had noticed how Sophia, Isabel, and Amelia sought out Clara's presence, how their little faces lit up slightly when she passed by to tidy their rooms or serve their meals. That particular morning, Richard had come downstairs earlier than usual and witnessed a scene that had deeply disturbed him. Clara was in the kitchen preparing the girls' breakfast when Isabel entered silently, tears streaming down her pale little face. The girl said nothing, just approached and hugged Clara's waist with desperate force. The maid immediately knelt, drying the child's tears with her apron, whispering gentle words that Richard couldn't fully hear from the ajar door. What had shocked him was the intensity of that hug, the way Isabel clung to Clara like a castaway to a life raft. Before he could enter and ask what had happened, Victoria appeared in the kitchen. Her tone was sweet but firm as she separated Isabel from Clara, saying something about it not being appropriate for the girls to disturb the staff during their work. Isabel stiffened instantly, the tears drying as if someone had turned off a faucet, her face returning to that disturbing mask of neutrality that had become her standard expression. Richard retreated down the hallway, his heart racing, feeling simultaneously cowardly and furious with himself. Why hadn't he gone in? Why hadn't he demanded an explanation? But something had stopped him, an inner voice whispering that he needed more than intuition and fragmented scenes. He needed certainty, concrete proof of whatever was happening in his own home when he wasn't looking. Now, watching Victoria descend the stairs with that perfect smile, Richard felt a cold determination settling in his chest. There was a crucial meeting scheduled in 3 days in New York, discussing the expansion of the hotel chain into the Canadian market. It would be a trip of at least a week, maybe 10 days. Everyone expected his presence, and he had spent months preparing for this negotiation. Victoria approached, kissing his cheek lightly. Her perfume was expensive and delicate. Everything about her was calculatedly perfect. She commented on having scheduled piano lessons for the girls, saying that structure and refined activities would help their development. Richard nodded mechanically, but his mind was already elsewhere, formulating a plan that would seem absurd to anyone who knew Richard Sterling, the billionaire businessman. That night, locked in his private study, Richard made a call to Evelyn Reed, his personal lawyer and a longtime friend. Evelyn answered with her characteristic efficiency, even though it was almost midnight. What Richard told her in the following minutes made the lawyer fall silent for long seconds before asking if he was sure about what he was proposing. Richard looked through the study window at the floodlit garden. He could see the reflection of the 3 windows of the girls' rooms on the upper floor. All the lights had been out for hours, but he knew at least one of them was not asleep. Amelia had been suffering from insomnia since Victoria moved into the estate. The doctors had prescribed calming teas and relaxation techniques, but nothing seemed to work. Yes, he was sure, he answered Evelyn. He was sure that something terrible was happening to his daughters. He was sure he would never forgive himself if he didn't find out the truth. And he was sure that the only way to see what really happened in that house was by becoming invisible, someone Victoria would never notice or bother to impress. Evelyn sighed heavily on the other end of the line, then asked how much time he needed. "A week," Richard replied, "maybe 2. Enough time to observe, to understand, to gather what he needed." The lawyer reluctantly agreed to help, warning of the legal and personal risks, but Richard barely listened. His decision was made. 3 days later, Richard Sterling officially left for New York on his private jet, bidding farewell to Victoria, with a chaste kiss, and to his daughters with hugs they returned mechanically, their empty little eyes nearly breaking his heart. But, instead of boarding the plane, he drove to a discreet motel 30 miles from Ashton Falls, where Evelyn was waiting with a suitcase containing simple clothes, a convincing fake beard, prescription glasses that subtly distorted his features, and a fake ID in the name of John Smith. Looking at himself in the motel's foggy bathroom mirror, Richard barely recognized his own reflection. The businessman in custom Italian suits had disappeared, replaced by an ordinary-looking middle-aged man with faded clothes and the stooped posture of someone who had spent his life in manual labor. Evelyn had even managed to create a convincing backstory. The estate's regular gardener, Mr. Evans, was on unexpected medical leave for a back problem, and the third-party agency would be sending a temporary replacement. When John Smith, the new gardener, presented himself at the service entrance of the imposing Sterling estate the next morning, carrying gardening tools and a forged but impeccable letter of recommendation, not even Mrs. Gable, who had known him since childhood, recognized him. The housekeeper received him with her usual professional courtesy, explaining the areas of the garden that needed special attention and the times he should avoid making noise so as not to disturb the family. Richard nodded humbly, keeping his eyes down, and headed to the tool shed at the back of the property. His hands, accustomed to shaking hands in boardrooms and signing million-dollar contracts, would now hold shovels and pruning shears. His body, kept in shape by personal trainers in luxury gyms, would now bend over flower beds. But as he organized the tools, his eyes were already mapping the property with a new perspective. From here, from the level of the staff, from the shadows and corners a millionaire would never notice, he would finally see the truth. And something inside him, a primal paternal instinct, whispered that the truth would be far worse than his worst nightmares. The first day as a gardener was just beginning, and Richard Sterling had no idea how profoundly his life was about to be transformed by what he was about to witness. The sun had not yet fully risen when Richard, disguised as John Smith, began his work in the front gardens of the estate. His hands, unaccustomed to the rough handle of the hoe, were already beginning to form small blisters that he stubbornly ignored. The physical pain was irrelevant compared to the anxiety gnawing at his stomach as he waited for any sign of movement inside the house. The first person to appear was Clara, coming out of the side door of the kitchen, carrying a basket of laundry to hang on the line out back. She passed him with a courteous nod and a brief smile, treating him exactly as she would any temporary worker. Richard muttered a hoarse, "Good morning," keeping his eyes on the roses he was pretending to prune with excessive attention. It was surreal to be yards from his own home, invisible to everyone he knew. Mrs. Gable appeared half an hour later, supervising the breakfast preparation through the kitchen window. Richard could see her gesturing instructions to the other maids, her usual efficiency intact, even though her face carried that constant worry he had noticed in recent weeks. The housekeeper eventually came out to check if the new gardener was finding everything he needed, and Richard nearly choked when she stopped just inches from him, critically examining his work. "You're doing a fine job," Mrs. Gable commented, adjusting the shawl over her shoulders against the morning mountain breeze. "Just be careful with those bushes over there in the corner. They were the late Mrs. Eleanor's favorite. The master insists they be treated with special care." Richard felt a lump in his throat, hearing Mrs. Gable mention his first wife, speaking of him as if he were a stranger. He nodded silently, bending lower over the plants to hide any betrayal in his expression. When Mrs. Gable returned inside, Richard allowed himself a moment for a deep breath. This was going to be harder than he had imagined, not just physically but emotionally. Every corner of that property held memories from the stone bench, where Eleanor used to read on Sunday afternoons, to the ornamental fountain the girls used for playing with paper boats in the summers. Now he was here, like an intruder in his own life, watching from the outside what he should be living on the inside. The real movement began around 7 in the morning. Richard had positioned himself strategically near a side window that offered a view of the dining room, pretending to weed a flower bed that didn't actually need attention. It was then that he saw Victoria descending the stairs, impeccable in a white linen suit, her blonde hair perfectly brushed and falling in soft waves over her shoulders. She checked something on her phone as she walked, her heels echoing on the marble floor of the hall. Moments later, Clara went up the stairs and returned leading the three girls by the hand. Richard felt his heart clench violently in his chest. Sophia, Isabel, and Amelia descended the steps with mechanical movements, dressed in identical, impeccably pressed school uniforms. But what broke his heart was the expression, or rather the lack of expression, on their little faces. They looked like porcelain dolls, beautiful but empty, without that spark of life that had always characterized them. Clara led them to the dining room where Victoria was already seated, flipping through an interior design magazine. The maid served orange juice for each girl with careful gestures, and Richard noticed how her fingers lingered a second longer on the children's little hands, a discreet, comforting touch they seemed to instinctively seek. "Good morning, girls," Victoria said without looking up from the magazine, her tone melodic but as cold as a winter breeze. "I hope you slept well and are ready for another productive day." The three murmured almost inaudible replies, and Richard saw Isabel open her mouth as if to say something more, but she quickly closed it, when Victoria raised her gaze with an expression that, even from a distance, conveyed a clear warning. Clara brought breakfast: warm French bread, cut fruit, plain yogurt. Richard watched Sophia poke at her yogurt with a spoon without really eating, her little eyes fixed on the plate as if memorizing every detail of it. Amelia picked up a strawberry, but held it in her hand, without bringing it to her mouth until Victoria reached out and took the fruit from the girls' fingers with a sharp movement. "We don't play with our food, Amelia," Victoria said, her voice still controlled but with a sharp edge beneath the smooth surface. "You either eat properly or you don't eat at all. Understood?" Amelia nodded quickly, her little hands trembling slightly as she picked up another fruit and brought it to her lips with nervous haste. Richard gripped the handle of the hoe so tightly his knuckles turned white. Clara, still in the room, was discreetly wiping the side table, but Richard could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes constantly darted towards the girls as if monitoring every move. When Sophia accidentally dropped a piece of bread on the floor, the girl froze completely, terror stamped on her little face. Victoria didn't even need to say anything. She just looked, and Sophia got down from her chair so quickly she nearly tripped, picking up the bread with trembling hands and murmuring repeated apologies. "That is unacceptable, Sophia," Victoria said, finally closing the magazine and giving the girls her full attention. "Well-behaved young ladies do not make messes. You know what happens when we make a mess." Sophia turned even paler, if that was possible, and nodded vigorously. Clara took a step forward as if to intervene, but stopped, biting her lower lip. Richard could see the conflict on her face, the desire to protect clashing with the need to keep her job, and likely, her position of trust near the children. The breakfast continued in oppressive silence. The girls ate small portions with careful movements, chewing slowly, avoiding any possibility of an accident. Victoria returned to her magazine, seemingly uninterested, but Richard noticed how she watched the girls from the corner of her eye, monitoring every gesture, every bite. When they finally finished, Clara began to clear the plates. It was then that Isabel, the most curious of the three, made the mistake of asking in a low voice if their father would be back from his trip soon. The silence that followed was almost physical in its density. Victoria placed the magazine on the table with calculated precision, her lips curving into something that tried to be a smile, but was too cold to pass for one. "Your father is very busy with important things, Isabel," Victoria replied, and each word came out crystal clear but laced with subtle poison. "Important men don't have time to stay home and play. That's why he left me in charge of taking care of you. Don't you trust that I know what's best?" Isabel shook her head affirmatively, but a single tear rolled down her cheek. "Don't cry," Victoria ordered, her tone now truly icy. "Crying is for the weak, and no one likes weak children." Richard had to step away from the window, his vision blurred by tears of rage and helplessness. He leaned against the exterior wall of the house, breathing deeply to keep from screaming, from breaking down the Sarusor and revealing everything right then and there. But he knew he couldn't. Not yet. He needed more. He needed to understand the full extent of it. He needed proof that no one could contest. When he managed to compose himself and return to his observation post, the girls had already been dismissed. Clara was accompanying them upstairs, probably to brush their teeth and get their school backpacks. Victoria remained in the dining room, but now her mask of serenity had completely fallen away. She picked up her phone and made a call, and even through the glass Richard could hear fragments of the conversation. "Yes, everything's according to plan," Victoria was saying, pacing back and forth with agitated steps. "He's in New York for at least another week." Silence as she listened to the reply from the other end. "No, they're not a problem. Children learn quickly when they understand who's in charge." More silence. Victoria laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound completely different from her public laugh. "Please, he barely looks at them when he's home, always too busy with his precious hotels. I doubt he'll notice anything." Richard felt nausea rising in his throat. To hear Victoria talk about him like that, to reduce his love for his daughters to neglect, was almost unbearable. But he forced himself to keep listening, engraving every word in his memory. The call continued for a few more minutes, with Victoria discussing something about documents and deadlines that Richard couldn't fully grasp. Eventually she hung up and went upstairs, leaving the dining room empty except for the breakfast crumbs and the suffocating weight of partial revelations. Richard returned to the mechanical work of gardening, his hands moving automatically while his mind processed what he had seen and heard. This had been happening for months, right under his nose, and he had been too blind or too trusting to notice. Victoria had built a psychological prison around his daughters, using her authority as a stepmother and his absence as a shield. Around 9 in the morning, a driver arrived to take the girls to the private school they attended in the center of Ashton Falls. Richard watched from a distance as Clara walked them to the car, adjusting the backpacks on their small shoulders, whispering something that made them manage faint smiles. Victoria supervised from the main door, her erect posture and serene expression perfectly composed for any outside observer. As soon as the car left, Victoria returned inside, and Richard saw her head to the office she had taken for herself on the second floor. Clara went back to the kitchen, where Mrs. Gable was already supervising the post-breakfast cleanup. Richard moved cautiously to a position where he could overhear the two women's conversation through the ajar kitchen window. "Mrs. Gable," Clara said in a low voice, looking around to make sure they were alone. "The girls are getting worse. Isabel cried on my shoulder last night when I went up to check if they were asleep. She said she can't remember what it's like to be happy." The older housekeeper sighed heavily, her hands stopping midway through drying a cup. "I know, dear. I see it. But what can we do? If we say something and she finds out, we're fired on the spot. And then who will protect the little ones?" Clara crossed her arms, her frustration visible. "But we can't just watch them waste away. Sophia barely ate 3 spoonfuls of yogurt today. Amelia had another nightmare last night, I heard her crying. And did you see Isabel's arms? When I changed the bed linens yesterday. Those marks aren't from playing, Mrs. Gable." Richard felt his blood run cold. What marks? He hadn't seen anything when he hugged the girls before his supposed trip. But then he remembered how they wore long-sleeved blouses even in the September heat, how they resisted when he tried to hug them more tightly. I know," Mrs. Gable repeated, her voice laden with anguish. "Mrs. Eleanor would be heartbroken if she saw what's happening to her daughters. Master Richard is a good man, but he's so focused on his business that she's managed to fool him completely. That woman has 2 faces, Clara. Sweet as honey when there's an audience, but cruel as a snake when she's alone with the girls." The 2 women continued talking in low tones, sharing observations and concerns that were piling up like stones in a wall of evidence. Richard heard it all, each word, hammering into his heart like nails in a coffin of lost innocence. When he finally moved away from the window, the sun was high in the sky, and he was covered in sweat, as much from the physical labor as from the emotional strain. The rest of the day passed in a haze of painful observations and hard work. Richard pruned bushes, cleaned flower beds, watered plants, always keeping his eyes and ears alert. He saw Victoria host 2 friends for afternoon tea, instantly transforming into the charming hostess, laughing melodiously as she served petits fours and discussed social events. No one seeing that performance would believe that hours earlier she had terrorized 3 children during a simple breakfast. When the girls returned from school, Richard witnessed the afternoon routine. Homework rigidly supervised by Victoria, who criticized every mistake with cutting remarks. Dinner in silence. Timed baths. Bed at 8 o'clock sharp with no exceptions. Clara was always nearby, a silent protective presence, but clearly powerless against the authority of the lady of the house. That night, lying in a tiny room at the back of the property reserved for temporary staff, Richard couldn't sleep. The images of the day replayed in his mind like a horror film. His daughters, his precious girls, were being systematically broken by a woman he had brought into their lives believing she would be their salvation. But now he knew the truth, or at least part of. Toistintufag, and as the moon rose over the Hudson Valley Mountains, Richard Sterling silently vowed that he would do whatever it took to free Sophia, Isabel, and Amelia from that invisible prison, even if it meant completely destroying the life he had built. The third day as a disguised gardener brought even more disturbing revelations. Richard woke before dawn, his muscles aching from the unaccustomed work, but his determination only strengthened by the discoveries of the previous days. He put on the simple clothes that now bore genuine stains of dirt and sweat, carefully glued on the fake beard that was already beginning to feel like a natural part of his face, and went out for another day of invisible observation. The morning began with a routine that was already becoming familiar and yet increasingly painful to witness. The girls came down for breakfast with the same mechanical movements, their pale little faces bearing dark circles that 6-year-old children shouldn't have. Victoria presided over the table with her usual cold elegance, but today there was something different in her mood, a poorly disguised irritation that Richard noticed immediately. Sophia was the first victim of the morning, the girl, likely distracted by childish thoughts that still resisted the constant oppression, spilled a single drop of orange juice on the imported white linen tablecloth. It was just one drop, tiny, practically invisible, but Victoria saw it. The silence that followed was absolute. Isabel and Amelia froze with their spoons in mid-air, their eyes wide with anticipated terror. "Sophia," Victoria said, her voice dangerously calm, "what is the rule about being careful at the table?" The girl opened her mouth, but no sound came out, her little face contorting in panic as she tried to form words. Richard, watching through the side window, while pretending to adjust the irrigation hose, felt his hands trembling with restrained rage. "I asked what the rule is," Victoria repeated, leaning slightly forward. Sophia finally managed to whisper something inaudible. "Louder," the stepmother ordered. "I can't hear cowards." "We must always be careful and not make a mess," Sophia said in a trembling voice, tears already starting to stream down her cheeks. "And what did you just do?" "I made a mess," the girl admitted, now sobbing openly. Victoria stood up with deliberately slow movements, walked over to Sophia, and pulled the girl's chair back with enough force to make her stumble. "Go to your room and stand there facing the wall until I decide you've learned your lesson. No toys, no books, no nothing. Just you and your thoughts on obedience." Sophia ran upstairs, her sobs echoing through the hall. Isabel and Amelia remained paralyzed, not daring to move or even breathe loudly. Clara, who was in the adjacent kitchen, appeared at the door with an expression of restrained pain. "Mrs. Blackwood, if I may, it was just a tiny drop. Perhaps we could—" But Victoria cut her off with an icy glare. "Clara, when I require a maid's opinion on how to educate my stepdaughters, I will ask for it. For now I suggest you attend to your own responsibilities." The maid retreated, but Richard saw her hands clench into tight fists, her knuckles turning white. Breakfast continued with Isabel and Amelia eating in absolute silence, every movement calculated to avoid any possibility of error. Richard had to move away from the window, the sight of his terrified daughters too much to bear. He walked to the back of the garden near the small grove of eucalyptus trees that marked the edge of the property and let the tears finally escape. How had he allowed this to happen? How had he been so blind, so absorbed in spreadsheets and meetings and hotel expansions that he hadn't noticed the terror growing in his own home? Eleanor had trusted him to protect the girls, and he had failed spectacularly at the one task that truly mattered. When he composed himself and returned to work, it was mid-morning. The driver had taken Isabel and Amelia to school, but Sophia remained at home as part of her punishment. Richard positioned himself strategically, near a side window on the second floor, from where he could see the hallway where the girls' rooms were located. For nearly 2 hours, Sophia stood there, a small, desolate figure facing the white wall of her room. Richard could see her through the ajar door, watching how the girl's little shoulders trembled occasionally with suppressed sobs, how she shifted her weight from one foot to the other, trying to alleviate the discomfort. No 6-year-old child should know that kind of cruel punishment, that calculated humiliation designed to break the spirit. It was Clara who finally risked going up with a glass of water. Richard saw her stop at the door of Sophia's room, look around cautiously to ensure Victoria wasn't nearby, and enter quickly. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but he saw Clara kneel to Sophia's level, gently dry the girl's tears, and offer the glass of water, which the child drank greedily. Clara then hugged Sophia for a long moment, rocking her slightly as if cradling a baby, and Richard saw the girl's tense little body relax slightly in that embrace. But the moment of tenderness was interrupted when Victoria's heels echoed in the hallway. Clara stood up quickly, smoothing her uniform, and exited the room just as the stepmother arrived. "What are you doing here, Clara?" "I brought little Sophia some water, Ma'am. She hadn't had anything to drink for hours." Victoria examined the maid with narrowed eyes. How thoughtful. But Sophia is being punished, and punishments do not include pampering. Next time, ask before you take initiative. "Yes, ma'am," Clara replied, lowering her head, but not before Richard saw the flash of defiance in her eyes. Victoria entered Sophia's room and closed the door. Richard couldn't see what was happening inside, but he could imagine. When the door finally opened 15 minutes later, Sophia stumbled out slightly, her face stained with tears but now also marked by something worse, a kind of empty resignation that no child should ever display. The rest of the day brought other equally distressing observations. Richard witnessed Victoria reprimanding Amelia for breathing too loudly during her piano lesson. He saw Isabel being forced to redo a drawing 5 times because Victoria had decided the chosen colors were too garish and showed a lack of refinement. He watched the 3 girls sit rigidly on the living room sofa during a visit from one of Victoria's friends, instructed to smile and wave but not to speak unless spoken to directly. Their performance was impeccable, 3 perfectly behaved little dolls who said exactly what was expected when the visitor asked how they were. "Very well, thank you," they replied in unison, their smiles so rehearsed they looked like painted masks. The visitor commented to Victoria on how well-behaved and disciplined the girls were, praising her maternal skills. Victoria accepted the compliments with false modesty, placing a possessive hand on Isabel's shoulder in a way that made the girl stiffen imperceptibly. But it was during the afternoon, when Victoria received a call and locked herself in the office to take it, that Richard witnessed something that made him question whether he should wait any longer to act. He was working in a flower bed near a side window of Victoria's office, and although she spoke in a low voice, the slightly open window allowed fragments of the conversation to reach him. "Yes, I understand the risks," Victoria was saying, her voice tense, "but you assured me it would be undetectable." Silence as she listened to the reply. "No, he doesn't suspect a thing. The man is completely absorbed in his business." More silence. "The girls are not a problem, I told you. They've already learned to keep quiet. When it's all finalized, they'll have a governess who will ensure they stay that way." Richard felt a chill run down his spine. This sounded like something far beyond domestic abuse. There was a larger plan in motion, something involving him in a way he didn't yet fully comprehend. He needed to find out more, needed to understand the full extent of the conspiracy before he acted. The call continued for a few more minutes with Victoria discussing deadlines and documents, mentioning names Richard didn't recognize and financial figures that deepened his suspicions. When she finally hung up, Richard heard the sound of drawers opening and closing, as if she were checking on something important stored there. That night, after the girls had been put to bed and the house had fallen silent, Richard found Clara alone in the laundry room at the back of the property. It was a calculated risk, but he needed an ally, someone who knew the intimate details of the house's routine and who clearly cared genuinely for the girls. Clara looked up in surprise when the door opened, likely expecting Mrs. Gable or one of the other maids. Seeing the temporary gardener, she frowned slightly. "Do you need something, Mr. Smith?" Richard closed the door behind him and checked that they were truly alone. Then, with deliberate movements, he removed the thick glasses and the fake beard. The transformation was dramatic. Clara dropped the laundry she was folding, her mouth falling open in absolute shock as she recognized the familiar features beneath the disguise. "Mr. Sterling," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But how? Why?" He raised a hand for silence and quickly explained in a low voice, the words coming out rushed but firm. "I knew something was wrong with my daughters. I needed to see for myself what was happening when I wasn't here. Clara, you have been the only light in their darkness. I've seen it. I've seen how you protect them, how you risk your job to show them a little kindness. And now I need your help to save them completely." Clara leaned against the washing machine, processing the information. Tears began to stream down her face, tears of relief and hope and fear all mixed together. "Mr. Sterling, it's been horrible. The things she does to them when you're not here, the punishments, the cruelty. I wanted to speak up, I wanted to report it, but I was afraid that without me here, they'd be left completely alone with that woman." Richard nodded, his own voice thick with emotion. "I know. I've seen it. And there's more, much more, that I don't fully understand yet. Victoria is planning something that goes beyond torturing my daughters. I need time to find out exactly what. I need irrefutable proof. And I need you, Clara. I need you to be my eyes and ears where I can't be, to help me document everything, to continue being the shield that protects the girls while I prepare the final blow." Clara wiped her tears with the back of her hand, and Richard saw determination settle in her eyes. "You can count on me, Mr. Sterling. I'll do whatever it takes. Those girls deserve to be happy again. They deserve to have their childhood back." He held her hands for a brief moment, a gesture of gratitude and complicity. "Thank you, Clara. I won't forget your courage and loyalty. Now we need to be careful. Victoria can't suspect a thing." They talked quickly, establishing discreet signals, safe moments to exchange information, ways to document the abuse without raising suspicion. When Richard finally put his disguise back on and left the laundry room, he felt different. He was no longer alone in this mission. He had an ally, someone who loved his daughters almost as much as he did. Returning to the humble little room at the back of the property, Richard allowed himself a moment of cautious hope. The pieces were moving on the board. Victoria believed she had total control, but he now saw the cracks in her armor. With Clara by his side, with his own invisibility maintained, he would be able to uncover the whole truth. And when he finally revealed everything, when he brought to light every cruelty, every lie, every conspiracy, Victoria would realize too late that she had completely underestimated a father's love for his daughters. That love, Richard silently swore, looking at the moon over the mountains, would be the force that would destroy the prison she had built and free Sophia, Isabel, and Amelia back into the light. The days following the revelation to Clara brought a new and dangerous dynamic. Richard and she developed a system of subtle signals, meaningful glances when they passed in the hallways, strategic positioning that allowed for coordinated observations. Clara discreetly began to document the abuses, noting dates, times, and specific details in a notebook she hid under the mattress in her room. Richard, for his part, intensified his observations. He discovered that Victoria kept a safe hidden behind a painting in her office, and he spent hours trying to figure out a way to access it without raising suspicion. Clara revealed that she had seen Victoria opening the safe a few times, always when she thought she was completely alone, storing documents that seemed too important to leave exposed. But it was on a rainy Wednesday in October that everything changed, when the event Richard most feared and simultaneously needed to witness finally occurred. The morning had started tense, with Victoria especially irritable due to a call she had received during breakfast. Something about documents that should have arrived and hadn't, tight deadlines, incompetent people. The girls, as always, paid the price for her frustration. During the math lesson that Victoria insisted on supervising personally, Amelia made the mistake of getting a simple sum wrong for the third time. Victoria snatched the notebook from the girl's hands with such force that she tore a page, screaming that she was stupid, lazy, a disgrace. Amelia began to cry, which only enraged Victoria more. "Stop whimpering right now," the stepmother ordered, gripping the girl's arm with enough force to leave marks. "Crying is for weak babies. Do you want me to treat you like a baby? Do you want me to put you in timeout in the dark closet like we do with disobedient children?" Sophia and Isabel watched in terror, huddled together on the study sofa. Richard, observing through the outside window while pretending to prune the nearby bushes, felt fury rise in his chest like lava about to erupt. His hands were shaking so much he could barely hold the pruning shears. When Victoria finally released Amelia, the girl ran to her room sobbing uncontrollably. The stepmother then turned her attention to Sophia and Isabel, warning them that if they didn't want the same treatment, they had better pay attention to everything they learned today. The two nodded vigorously, their faces pale with terror. The afternoon brought a temporary calm. Victoria received a visit from her personal dressmaker for fittings on new dresses she had ordered for the charity event season. During these hours, the girls had a respite, playing quietly in their rooms under Clara's discreet but protective watch. Richard took the opportunity to explore areas of the property he hadn't yet properly inspected. He discovered that from the attic, through a small window covered with vines, he had a direct view of Victoria's office. He positioned himself there, watching as she reviewed documents spread across her desk after the dressmaker had left. Around 5 in the afternoon, the girls were called for their baths and to prepare for dinner. Clara went up to help them, a task that would normally be Victoria's, but that the stepmother had delegated to the maid, preferring to spend her time on mysterious phone calls and correspondence. It was when they were returning from ballet school, a weekly commitment Victoria insisted on keeping because it made the girls look refined to outside observers, that the incident happened. The driver brought them back around 6:30, and the three entered through the main door carrying their pink bags with their ballet slippers. Victoria was waiting for them in the entrance hall, dressed for a social dinner she would attend later. She was especially elegant in a navy blue dress that enhanced her light eyes, discreet but expensive jewelry adorning her neck and wrists. Upon seeing the girls, her smile was seemingly affectionate, but Richard, watching from his position near the living room window, saw the coldness behind the mask. "How was class, girls?" Victoria asked, her voice melodious. "Fine," they replied in unison. "Did the teacher say you behaved?" "Yes, ma'am." "Excellent. Now go upstairs, take your baths and get dressed for dinner. We have a special guest tonight." The girls started up the stairs when Isabel, in a moment of courage or perhaps a momentary lapse of her constant fear, turned and asked, "Is Daddy back? Is he the special guest?" The silence that followed was absolute. Victoria froze in place, her expression rapidly transforming from false kindness to icy fury. Richard saw the exact moment the stepmother lost her carefully maintained control. "How dare you?" Victoria hissed, advancing towards the stairs with quick steps. "How dare you mention your father in front of me like that, as if he cared enough to come? Back for you?" Isabel backed away, stumbling into Sophia, who was behind her. The fear on their little faces was visceral. Victoria grabbed Isabel by the arm and began to drag her up the stairs, too furious to care about gentleness or discretion. "I will teach you to question my decisions. I will teach you that your father doesn't care about you, that he left me in charge because he can't stand to be around 3 spoiled, unbearable children." Isabel cried out in pain as Victoria pulled her with excessive force, causing the girl to hit her knee on the marble step. Sophia and Amelia started to cry, frozen in the middle of the staircase, not knowing whether to help their sister or run away. It was at that moment that Clara appeared at the top of the stairs, drawn by the screams. She saw Victoria dragging Isabel by her hair, saw the absolute terror on the girl's face, saw the other 2 sisters paralyzed with fear. And something inside the maid, something that had been compressed and suffocated for months of witnessing these horrors in silence, finally broke. Mrs. Blackwood, stop it now, Clara said, her voice firm and loud. Victoria turned, shocked to be interrupted, even more so by a simple maid. What did you say? Clara descended a few steps, placing herself between Victoria and the girls. I said stop. Isabel did nothing wrong. She just asked about her father, which is natural and normal. She misses him, they all do. Victoria's face turned red with rage. How dare you give me orders in my own house? You are a maid, a nobody. Get back to your place before I fire you on the spot. Clara held her ground, trembling but determined. You can fire me if you want, Mum, but I will not stand by and watch you hurt these children. They don't deserve this treatment, no child does. Richard, watching the scene through the side window that gave a view of the hall and staircase, felt his heart race violently. Clara was risking everything, her job, her safety, to defend his daughters. The courage of that simple woman, without power or resources, was more impressive than any act of corporate bravery he had ever witnessed. Victoria let go of Isabel with a shove that sent the girl falling onto the steps. She then advanced on Clara with rapid strides and, before the maid could react, delivered a violent slap across her face. The sound echoed through the hall like a thunderclap. You are fired, Victoria screamed. Pack your things and get off my property immediately, and you can forget about any reference or final pay. No one disrespects Victoria Blackwood and gets away with it. Clara brought a hand to her face, where the red mark of Victoria's hand was already forming. Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not let them fall. Instead, she lifted her chin and looked directly at Victoria. I will leave. Ma'am, but Mr. Sterling will know exactly why I'm leaving. I will make sure he knows everything you do to these girls when he's not here. Tell him whatever you want, Victoria laughed, a cruel and confident sound. Do you think he'll believe the word of a maid against his wife's? I'm the one who sleeps in his bed, who runs this house, who has access to everything he owns. You are nothing. Clara looked at the three girls, who were now huddled together in the middle of the staircase, crying silently. Her eyes met each of theirs, conveying a message of love and apology. Then she descended the rest of the stairs with dignity, walked past Victoria without looking back, and headed towards the staff quarters to collect her few possessions. Richard, still hidden behind the hedge in the outer garden, had witnessed everything through the window. His heart was shattered, not only by the violence he had seen inflicted upon the brave woman who had defended his daughters, but by the devastating realization of his own powerlessness in that moment. He, the powerful father, the businessman who commanded an empire of luxury hotels, was hiding in disguise while a humble maid risked everything for his children. But he had also seen something else. He had seen Victoria's true nature completely exposed, without masks or pretense. He had seen the cruelty, the violence, the utter contempt for anyone who challenged her authority. And most importantly, he had personally witnessed an act of physical and emotional abuse so blatant that no court could ignore it when he finally presented the evidence. After Victoria went upstairs, taking the girls to their rooms with harsh warnings about behavior and consequences, Richard circled the property to the back entrance. He needed to speak to Clara before she left, needed to ensure she understood that this was not in vain. He found her in the small room she occupied, stuffing her clothes into an old suitcase with jerky movements dictated by emotion. Tears were finally streaming freely down her face, mingling with the red mark that still burned on her cheek. Clara, Richard whispered from the door, after checking they were alone. She turned quickly, angrily wiping her tears. Mr. Sterling, I'm so sorry. I tried to control myself, but when I saw her hurting Isabel like that, I couldn't stay quiet anymore. No, I've ruined your observation plan, but I just couldn't. You didn't ruin anything, he interrupted, entering and closing the door. You did exactly what I should have had the courage to do months ago. You defended my daughters when I was cowardly hiding behind a disguise. Your courage both shames and inspires me. Clara shook her head. But now I can't help anymore. I'm being kicked out. The girls will be alone with her. Richard held her shoulders firmly. Not for long. What happened today was the final straw. I saw everything, Clara. I saw her hit you. I saw how she dragged Isabel. I heard every cruel word. We now have a direct witness to physical abuse, not just indirect observations. This changes everything. He took a card from his pocket, handwritten with contact information. "This is the address of Evelyn Reed, my lawyer. Go to her today, tell her everything you saw and lived through. She will prepare your formal statement. In the meantime, I'm going to accelerate my plan. I can't wait any longer. Not after what I saw today. The girls have suffered enough." Clara took the card with trembling hands. "And Mrs. Blackwood? She won't take this without a fight." Richard smiled, but it was a cold, humorless smile. Victoria built a castle of lies and cruelty. It's time to tear that castle down, stone by stone, starting with its rotten foundations. And when I'm finished, she will realize she completely underestimated the strength of a father who loves his daughters. After Clara left, taking with her the painful memories but also the hope of coming justice, Richard returned to the back room he occupied as the gardener. He lay on the narrow bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, and made his plans. Tomorrow, the next phase would begin. He needed to access that safe in Victoria's office, find out what documents she guarded so carefully, and fully understand the extent of her conspiracy. Clara had given him valuable information about Victoria's routine, times when she left for social engagements, moments when the office was unoccupied, and then, when he had all the pieces of the puzzle, when he knew every secret, every lie, every evil plan, he would orchestrate the final confrontation. It would be public, it would be irrefutable, and it would be devastating. Victoria wanted social status, the respect of Ashton, Falls elite, the image of a dedicated stepmother and perfect wife. Richard would ensure she lost all of it before the very eyes she so desperately wanted to impress. But first, the girls had to survive a few more days under that roof, and Richard, even hidden in disguise, silently vowed that he would remain vigilant every second, that he would not allow any further harm to come to Sophia, Isabel, and Amelia. The lion had thought he was sleeping, but now he was awake, and his fury would be relentless. Clara's absence was immediately felt. The morning after her forced dismissal, Richard watched the girls come down for breakfast, with expressions even more desolate than usual. Their little eyes, red from crying all night, instinctively searched for the familiar figure of the maid who always offered them small gestures of comfort, but Clara was no longer there. Victoria presided over the breakfast table with poorly disguised satisfaction, like a queen who had just eliminated a threat to her throne. She commented casually that Clara had left for personal reasons, that employees came and went, that the girls shouldn't get attached to staff. Sophia, Isabel, and Amelia ate in a silence even more oppressive than usual, each lost in her own sadness. Mrs. Gable, who had witnessed the previous day's scene from a distance, but had heard the details from the other maids, walked through the house with a somber expression. Richard noticed how the elderly housekeeper avoided eye contact with Victoria, how her movements were stiffer, laden with restrained anger. But Mrs. Gable had a family to support, decades of loyalty to the Sterling family that she couldn't simply abandon. So she remained, watching over the girls with worried eyes but powerless to do more. Richard dedicated the morning to exploring different observation angles of the house. He discovered that from the small terrace on the roof of the tool shed, accessible by a rusty external ladder, he had a view of several second-floor windows, including Victoria's office. He settled there during the period he knew the stepmother had an appointment with her personal trainer, a Pilates class she never missed. Through the small binoculars Evelyn had provided with the disguise, Richard observed the empty office. The safe was behind an oil painting of a mountain landscape. He already knew that, but he needed the combination, or an opportunity, to force it open when he was absolutely certain he wouldn't be interrupted. It was during lunch, served to the girls in Victoria's absence as she was lunching out with friends, that Richard overheard a crucial conversation. Mrs. Gable was supervising the girls as they ate in the smaller, more informal dining room, while two other maids, Jane and Lucy, were cleaning the adjacent room. Richard positioned himself outside the ajar window, pretending to check a dripping faucet. "Mrs. Gable, did you see Isabel's arms this morning when I helped her get dressed?" Jane asked in a low voice, clearly, trying not to be heard by the girls. The housekeeper nodded gravely. "I did. And those aren't marks from playing, are they?" Jane shook her head, her expression revolted. "They look like ligature marks, as if something was wrapped tightly around her wrists, And there are purple spots too, like bruises. Lucy approached the two, checking that the girls were distracted, picking at the food on their plates. Amelia has marks too, she revealed in a whisper. I saw them when I changed her bedsheets yesterday. Scratches on her back and small burns like from a cigarette on the inside of her arm. Mrs. Gable closed her eyes briefly, as if praying for strength. This is getting worse. Since Clara left, she's taking all her anger out on the little ones. Richard felt nausea rising in his throat. Burns? Ligature marks? This was no longer just psychological abuse or excessive punishment. This was the systematic torture of 6-year-old children. His hands were shaking so much he had to lean against the exterior wall to keep from stumbling. Last night, Jane continued, I heard Amelia screaming. She was having a nightmare. I ran to her room and she was sitting up in bed crying, saying the stepmother was going to lock her in the dark closet again. I had to calm her for almost an hour before she went back to sleep. Mrs. Gable sighed heavily. Sophia has been eating almost nothing for weeks. She's just skin and bones. And Isabel is starting to react dangerously. Yesterday she talked back to one of Mrs. Blackwood's orders and received a terrible punishment. The three women fell silent for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. Eventually, Lucy whispered the question they were all thinking. What can we do? If we report it and nothing comes of it, she finds out and fires us. And then who will protect the girls? Mrs. Gable replied in a tired voice. We can only hope that Mr. Sterling returns from his trip soon and finally opens his eyes to what's happening in his own home. Richard had to move away from the window, tears blurring his vision. These loyal, dedicated women were doing their best to protect his daughters within their limitations. And here he was, the father, the man with all the power and resources, hiding behind a disguise while his girls suffered unimaginable horrors. No more, he vowed silently. Not a few more days. He would end this now, today, if possible. He just needed access to that safe, to the evidence he knew was there. Clara was already with Evelyn preparing a formal statement. The physical marks on the girls' bodies would be documented by doctors, but Richard was sure there was more, documents that would reveal the true extent of Victoria's plans. The opportunity came sooner than he expected. Around 3 in the afternoon, Victoria received an urgent call and left hastily in her imported sports car, telling Mrs. Gable she would only be back for dinner. Something about a problem with a flower supplier for a charity event she was organizing. Richard waited 15 minutes to ensure she was truly gone, then entered through the back door, as any employee would to get tools from the internal storage. He went up the service staircase to the 2nd floor with silent steps, his heart beating so loudly he feared the sound would give him away. Victoria's office was a meticulously organized space, all in shades of white and gold, expensive furniture, sophisticated decor. Richard went straight to the painting that hid the safe, a landscape of the mountains that, ironically, he himself had bought years ago for Eleanor. He carefully removed the painting and found himself facing the digital safe. He tried obvious combinations first. Victoria's date of birth, her name in numbers. Nothing worked. He was starting to sweat when he remembered something Clara had mentioned. Victoria always used the same number for everything, a personal superstition related to some lucky event in her youth. The number was 1873. With trembling fingers, Richard typed in the combination. The safe emitted a soft beep and the door swung open. What he found inside made his blood run cold. Detailed financial documents about his companies, including accounts and investments that not even his closest partners knew about completely. A complete dossier on him. Medical history, habits, frequent travels, even copies of personal emails he had no idea how she had obtained. There were also printed out research papers on toxic substances difficult to detect in toxicology exams, poisons that mimicked the symptoms of natural medical conditions. Richard picked up one of the documents with hands shaking so much the paper visibly trembled. It was a draft of a power of attorney with a crude forgery of his signature, giving Victoria total power over all his assets in case of incapacitation or absence. There was also a life insurance policy he had never signed, naming Victoria as the sole beneficiary of an obscene amount. But what truly horrified him was the manila envelope at the bottom of the safe. Inside were small vials with unidentified liquids, syringes still in their packaging, and handwritten notes detailing dosages and effects. Beside it, a calendar marked with specific dates, the next one being a week from then, exactly when Richard was supposed to return from his planned business trip. The pieces finally clicked into place in Richard's mind, like a macabre puzzle revealing a terrifying image. Victoria wasn't just planning to control his daughters through psychological abuse. She was planning to eliminate him, make it look like he was the victim of an accident or a sudden illness, and then assume total control of his entire fortune. The girls would be kept under her guardianship through funds she herself would manage, too broken to question, too traumatized to resist. The entire marriage had been calculated from the beginning. The charming woman he had met at the plaza, the seemingly dedicated stepmother during their courtship. It had all been an elaborate performance. Victoria was a patient predator who had spent years planning, studying, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Richard photographed every document with a disposable phone that Evelyn had provided specifically for this purpose. Every page of the dossier, every research paper on poisons, every draft of a forged power of attorney. He worked quickly but meticulously, knowing that these images would be crucial evidence. He was just finishing when he heard a noise downstairs. Voices. Victoria had returned earlier than expected. Richard put everything back in the safe exactly as he had found it, replaced the painting on the wall, and slipped out of the office with silent steps. He managed to reach the service staircase just as he heard Victoria's heels echoing in the entrance hall. Back in the tool shed, temporarily safe, Richard allowed himself a moment to process the magnitude of what he had discovered. This wasn't just child abuse. It was a conspiracy for premeditated murder, document forgery, and a planned embezzlement of an entire fortune. Victoria wasn't just cruel, she was dangerously criminal. He had to act fast now. Every day that passed put both him and the girls in real danger. He picked up his phone and called Evelyn, using the secure phone they maintained for emergency communication. "Evelyn, I have everything," he said without preamble when she answered. "Documents, photos, evidence of a murder conspiracy. We need to move now." The lawyer was silent for a second, processing the information. "Richard, if it's as serious as you say, we need to involve the authorities immediately, and we need to ensure the girls' safety." "I agree," he replied. "What's the next step?" Evelyn thought quickly. "Tomorrow night. Victoria has that charity dinner she organizes annually, remember? Half of Ashton Falls's elite will be there, including the court judge, the police chief, influential business people." Richard felt a cold smile form on his lips. "Are you suggesting what I think you are?" "Exactly," Evelyn confirmed. "A public confrontation with irrefutable witnesses, evidence presented to the authorities present. She'll have nowhere to run, no way to spin the narrative." Richard thought for a moment. It was risky, theatrical, but also perfectly calculated. Victoria wanted to impress society, to maintain her image as a sophisticated and charitable woman. Seeing that image publicly destroyed, in front of the very people whose admiration she most coveted, would be poetic justice. "Make it happen," Richard said. "Prepare a multimedia presentation with all the evidence. Contact the chief and the judge beforehand. Make sure they're prepared to act. And Evelyn, make sure Clara is there too. She deserves to see the moment her courage finally brings justice." After hanging up, Richard returned to his gardening work to keep up appearances. But now every movement had a renewed purpose. The end was coming. Just one more day, one more night, and then the truth would explode like a bomb in the controlled environment of Victoria's social event. That night, watching the lit windows of the girls' rooms, Richard whispered a promise to the wind blowing from the mountains. "Hold on just a little longer, my princesses. Daddy is going to bring you back to the light. Tomorrow everything changes. Tomorrow, justice finally reaches the villain who stole your innocence. And tomorrow, Victoria Blackwood would discover that no matter how carefully one plans evil, there will always be a father's love that is stronger, more determined, and more relentless in its quest to protect the innocent. The lion would finally roar and his fury would be unforgettable. The day of the confrontation dawned with a clear sky over Ashton Falls, an ironic contrast to the storm that was preparing to break over Victoria Blackwood. Richard had barely slept, spending the night mentally reviewing every detail of the plan, every possible variable that could go wrong. Evelyn had called 3 times during the early hours with updates, confirming that everything was being meticulously prepared. The morning at the estate passed with an underlying tension that only Richard could fully feel. Victoria was visibly excited, floating through the house in a silk robe as she supervised the final preparations for that evening's charity dinner. Florists arrived with elaborate arrangements. The catering team tested the sound and lighting system in the ballroom that occupied an entire wing of the residence, and Victoria herself spent hours on the phone coordinating every tiny detail. The girls were kept in their rooms for most of the day, instructed to stay quiet and out of the way. Victoria planned to present them briefly to the guests, a carefully choreographed demonstration of her maternal dedication. Richard watched as a children's stylist arrived to get the 3 of them ready, dressing them in identical dark blue velvet dresses with white sashes, and combing their hair into elaborate braids. Sophia, Isabel, and Amelia submitted to the stylist's attentions like rag dolls, without resistance, but also without enthusiasm. Richard, watching through the window while pretending to prune nearby roses, felt his heart ache to see how his girls had been reduced to decorative accessories in Victoria's social performance. Around noon, Evelyn sent a coded message confirming that everything was ready. Police Chief Miles Corbin and Judge Robert Davies, both men of integrity whom Richard knew through business circles, had been discreetly informed about the true nature of the event. They would arrive prepared to act, with warrants already signed in case the evidence presented justified an immediate arrest. Clara had also been contacted. Initially reluctant to return to the estate even temporarily, she agreed when Evelyn explained that her testimony would be crucial. The lawyer had assured her that she would be protected, that Victoria would have no opportunity for retaliation. Richard spent the afternoon on his own preparations. In the tiny room out back, he carefully removed the disguise he had worn for so many days. The fake beard was put away, the thick glasses set aside, the humble clothes folded. He took a long shower, washing away weeks of dirt and sweat and feigned humiliation. When he finally looked in the mirror, it was Richard Sterling who looked back, not John Smith. But it was not yet time to reveal himself. He had to wait for the exact moment when the stage was set and the audience was present. Evelyn would arrive early, posing as a guest, carrying the multimedia presentation equipment in a discreet briefcase. Mrs. Gable, who had been informed that morning of the real plan, had agreed to help by ensuring nothing interfered with the schedule. At 5 in the afternoon, the guests began to arrive. Imported cars parked in the wide front courtyard, elegant couples alighting with invitations printed on gold-embossed letterhead. Victoria received them all with a radiant smile, stunning in an emerald green gala dress that had cost a small fortune, jewels glittering at her neck and ears. Richard watched everything from a strategic point he had chosen, a small service balcony that overlooked the ballroom, but remained hidden by heavy curtains. He saw familiar faces, people he knew from similar events, businessmen with whom he had negotiated, women who were part of the same social circle Eleanor had frequented. Evelyn arrived exactly at 6, impeccable in a simple but elegant black dress, carrying the briefcase that contained a laptop and a portable projector. She greeted Victoria with social kisses, praised the decor, and mingled among the guests with the natural ease of someone who belonged in that world. No one suspected she was there on a mission that would utterly destroy the hostess. Around 7, when the ballroom was already filled with perhaps 50 guests chatting animatedly, while waiters circulated with champagne and canapes, Victoria signaled for the girls to be brought down. Mrs. Gable led them by the hand, 3 small, perfect figures in their velvet dresses. Sophia, Isabel, and Amelia descended the ballroom's main staircase with careful steps, their faces composed in polite but empty smiles. Guests murmured appreciations about how beautiful they were, how blessed Victoria was to have such well-behaved stepdaughters. The stepmother placed possessive hands on the shoulders of Isabel and Amelia, pulling them close while Sophia stood slightly apart. "Look at these princesses," Victoria said to a woman nearby, her voice full of false maternal affection. "They are the joy of my life. Since I had the privilege of becoming their mother, I have dedicated every moment to ensuring they grow up to be refined and educated young ladies." The woman responded with a complimentary remark about Victoria's dedication, completely oblivious to the terror that pulsed beneath the girl's polished surface. Richard watched the scene with clenched jaws. This nauseating performance, Victoria using his traumatized daughters as props to impress society, was so revolting he had to restrain himself from interrupting right then. But no, he had to wait. The moment had to be perfect. After their brief presentation, the girls were dismissed back to their rooms. Richard saw the subtle relief on their little faces as Mrs. Gable led them away from the ballroom. The housekeeper cast a discreet glance in the direction where she knew Richard was hidden, a silent confirmation that the girls would be safe and away from what was about to happen. Dinner was served at 8, an elaborate 5-course banquet prepared by a renowned chef Victoria had hired specifically to impress. Guests sat at tables decorated with extravagant floral arrangements, fine china, and crystal glasses. Conversations flowed about business, politics, and upcoming social events. Victoria sat at the head of the main table, radiant in her element. To her right was an influential real estate developer. To her left was Judge Robert Davies, who had attended previous charity events. Chief Miles Corbin was a few chairs down, chatting amiably with his wife about a recent trip to Europe. Evelyn, seated strategically near the sound system where she would connect her equipment when the time came, ate mechanically while observing the room. She exchanged a brief glance with Richard through the ajar curtain, a silent confirmation that she was ready. Between dessert and coffee, when everyone's attention was relaxed by the excellent food and abundant champagne, Victoria stood to make her traditional speech. She thanked everyone for their presence, spoke eloquently about the charitable cause the event supported, a local orphanage that received funds raised through a silent auction to be held after dinner. The irony was so grotesque that Richard almost laughed. Victoria, speaking about helping children in need while torturing 3 in her own home. The hypocrisy was monumental, but soon everyone there would see through the carefully constructed mask. When Victoria finished her speech, to polite applause, Evelyn stood up smoothly. "With your permission, Mrs. Blackwood," she said, loud enough to be heard by all, "before the auction, I believe there is an additional presentation that deserves the attention of those present, something related to the Sterling family that everyone will appreciate knowing." Victoria frowned slightly, confusion crossing her face. "I don't recall our planning an additional presentation, Ms. Reed." Evelyn smiled, but it was a professional, cold smile. "It was a last-minute addition, ma'am. I assure you it will be relevant and memorable for everyone present, especially for you." Something in Evelyn's tone set off an alarm in Victoria's mind. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but surrounded by guests and bound by social expectations, she couldn't refuse without seeming rude. "Very well," she said slowly. "Proceed." Evelyn quickly connected her laptop to the projection system, a large screen descending from the wall for presentations. The guests settled in, curious about what surprise awaited. Chief Corbin and Judge Davies exchanged a significant look, both knowing the moment had arrived. It was then that Richard emerged from the shadows. He walked down the side corridor leading to the ballroom, his steps echoing in the expectant silence. When he appeared at the entrance to the ballroom, still wearing the simple gardener's clothes but with the erect posture of the businessman he was, the reaction was instantaneous. Collective gasps echoed through the room. People stood up in surprise, but it was Victoria whose reaction was most telling. She turned dramatically pale, her hand flying to her neck as if the air had suddenly been sucked out. "Richard," she whispered, absolute shock stamped on every line of her face. "You were in New York, how?" Richard walked slowly through the ballroom, all eyes fixed on him. "Funnily enough, my dear wife, I haven't been in New York for the past week. I've been right here, under your very nose, working in the gardens, watching, learning fascinating truths about how you run our home when you think no one important is watching." Confused murmurs rippled through the guests. Victoria tried to laugh, but the sound came out strangled, artificial. "Richard, I don't understand this joke. You're embarrassing us all with this strange performance." "It's not a joke, Victoria," Richard replied, his voice firm and cold. "It's a revelation, and I believe our distinguished guests, especially Chief Corbin and Judge Davies, will find it extremely relevant." Evelyn clicked the laptop and the first image appeared on the screen. It was a photo of Sophia, Isabel and Amelia from breakfast a few days ago, their faces pale and terrified, deep dark circles marking their childish faces. The image next to it showed the same girls from months before the wedding, smiling radiantly at a birthday party. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice carrying the weight of months of restrained pain, "I have come here tonight to expose the truth about the woman who presents herself as a dedicated wife and loving stepmother. The truth is very different and much darker than her elegant facade suggests." Victoria stood up abruptly, knocking over her chair. "This is absurd. Have you gone mad, Richard? How dare you humiliate me like this?" But Richard continued relentlessly, as Evelyn advanced the slides to show the photographed documents from the safe, the evidence of the conspiracy, the research on poisons. The audience watched in growing shock. When images of the marks on the girls' arms appeared, discreetly photographed by Mrs. Gable, following Richard's instructions, women gasped in horror. When the forged powers of attorney and fraudulent insurance policies were projected, the businessmen murmured indignantly. It was then that Clara entered, led by Mrs. Gable. The former maid, still bearing the faint yellowing mark of the slap she had received days before, walked to the front of the ballroom. Victoria saw her, and any remaining composure vanished. "You," she hissed. "You're supposed to be long gone." Clara lifted her chin bravely. "I'm here to speak the truth, Mrs. Blackwood. The truth about how you treat these innocent children when you think no one is watching." And then, in front of 50 shocked people, Clara began her testimony. She spoke of the cruel punishments, the constant humiliations, the daily psychological terror. She described the scene on the staircase, the moment Victoria had dragged Isabel by her hair while screaming that their father didn't want them. Chief Corbin was already on his feet, his hand on his phone, likely calling for backup. Judge Davies watched with a stern expression, clearly evaluating the evidence presented with a trained legal eye. Victoria looked around desperately, seeing the admiration in the guests' eyes turn to horror and repulsion. "This is a setup," she screamed, her voice high with panic. You know me. You know what kind of person I am." Richard took a step forward. "Yes, Victoria. Now we know exactly what kind of person you are, and I assure you, you will pay for every tear my daughters have shed, for every moment of terror you inflicted on them, and for the grotesque conspiracy to murder me and steal everything I've built." The ballroom erupted in shocked conversation. The transformation on Victoria's face, from elegant hostess to a desperate, furious creature, completed the dramatic picture. The mask had finally fallen completely, and everyone saw the monster that had been hiding beneath the polished surface. When Chief Corbin approached with handcuffs, announcing that Victoria Blackwood was under arrest for multiple charges, including child abuse, document forgery, and conspiracy to commit murder, it was in front of the very audience she had so desperately wanted to impress, and those distinguished witnesses would never forget the night they saw the mask of civility ripped away to reveal the pure cruelty underneath. The ballroom that minutes before had been pulsing with elegant conversation and social laughter now seethed with commotion and shock. Guests huddled in small groups, whispering among themselves as they witnessed a scene they had never imagined. Victoria Blackwood, the impeccable hostess who had welcomed them with radiant smiles, was now being handcuffed by Chief Miles Corbin while she screamed incoherent accusations at everyone around her. "This is a conspiracy," Victoria shrieked, her voice completely losing the cultivated melody that had always characterized it. "Richard is lying. He wants to get rid of me to be with that filthy maid." Clara flinched slightly at the venom in her words, but Richard placed a protective hand on her shoulder, keeping her steady. "Mrs. Blackwood," Chief Corbin said in a professional but firm voice, "you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The charges are extremely serious, and the evidence presented here tonight, combined with the testimony of multiple individuals, justifies your immediate arrest." Victoria tried to pull away, but a second officer who had arrived in response to the chief's call held her arm firmly. "You'll all regret this," she hissed, looking around at the faces that had once smiled at her and now watched with a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. "All of you. You think you know me. You know nothing." Judge Robert Davies approached Richard as the officers led Victoria out of the ballroom. "Richard, that was brave, but also risky. Is the evidence you presented substantial?" The businessman nodded gravely. "I have everything documented, Your Honor. Photographs, audio recordings where possible, staff testimony, and the physical documents that prove the conspiracy. My lawyer has secure copies of everything." The judge shook his head heavily. "The children will need immediate medical examinations to document the physical abuse. I will ensure the case is handled with the utmost urgency. No child should suffer what your daughters have suffered." Richard felt a lump in his throat. "Thank you, I just want them to be safe now so they can begin to heal." The guests began to disperse, some too shocked to remain, others commenting among themselves about the scandal that would surely dominate conversations in Ashton Falls for months. A few women approached Richard, offering support, expressing horror at what they had heard and seen. A businessman he had known for years shook his hand firmly, saying he admired the courage he had shown. When the last guest finally left, the ballroom fell into a surreal silence. The elaborate decorations still glittered under the soft lights. The tables still held the remnants of the expensive dinner, but the atmosphere was completely transformed. Evelyn approached Richard, disconnecting her equipment with practical efficiency. "It was perfect," she said. "It couldn't have gone better. The evidence was presented to the right authorities. Dozens of respectable witnesses saw everything, and Victoria completely lost control, revealing her true nature. There's no way she can wriggle out of this." Richard nodded but felt no triumph. "I just feel empty now, Evelyn, and worried." "Did the girls hear all of that?" Mrs. Gable, who had remained discreetly nearby throughout the confrontation, answered, "No, Mr. Sterling. I kept them in their rooms with the door closed and music playing softly. They're waiting nervously. They sense something important is happening, but they didn't hear the details." "Good," Richard sighed. "I don't want them reliving the trauma through second-hand accounts. They've suffered enough." Clara touched his arm lightly. "Mr. Sterling, the girls need to see you. They need to know they're safe now, that that woman will never hurt them again." He looked at the brave maid who had risked everything for his daughters, and he saw a wisdom in her eyes that went beyond her years. "You're right. I'll go to them now." Climbing the stairs that led to the girls' rooms, Richard felt an unexpected nervousness. How would he explain all this to 6-year-old children? How would he make them understand that Daddy had been here all along, hidden, watching but seemingly unable to intervene until the right moment? How would he heal the deep wounds Victoria had inflicted on their small, fragile souls? He stopped before the door of the shared bedroom. He could hear low voices inside, nervous whispers. He knocked, gently, and the voices ceased immediately. "Girls, it's me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's Daddy. Can I come in?" Silence. Then Sophia's small, hesitant voice. "Daddy? You're really back?" The door opened slowly, and there they were. Sophia, Isabel, and Amelia, still dressed in their blue velvet dresses, but now with confused and hopeful expressions. When they saw it was really him, not John the gardener, but Daddy Richard, the reaction was instantaneous. Sophia was the first to move, running into his arms with a sob that broke Richard's heart into 1,000 pieces. Isabel and Amelia followed seconds later, and he knelt to embrace all three simultaneously, feeling their small bodies tremble against him as they cried tears that had been building up for months. "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy," they repeated like a mantra, clutching his shirt with desperate little hands as if they feared he would disappear again. Richard held them tight, letting his own tears finally flow freely. "I'm here, my princesses. I'm here, and I will never let anyone hurt you again. Never again." Isabel was the first to ask the question they all wanted answered. "Is the mean stepmother gone? Is she not coming back?" Richard pulled back slightly so he could look into all three pairs of eyes. "No, my love, she's not coming back. She did bad things, very bad things, and now important people are going to make sure she stays away from you forever. Amelia, the most sensitive, touched Richard's face with a small hand. You were here the whole time, Daddy. Was that you in the garden? Richard nodded, impressed by her perception. Yes, my little one. Daddy disguised himself as a gardener because I needed to see with my own eyes what was happening. I'm sorry I didn't believe you sooner, that I didn't protect you earlier. Sophia shook her head vigorously. It's not Daddy's fault. She was nice when you were here. It was only when you went away that she got mean. Richard felt a renewed anger towards Victoria for her calculated manipulation, but he forced himself to keep his voice calm. I know, sweetie. She fooled all of us. But it's over now. The girls bombarded him with questions for the next hour. Where had he slept? How had no one recognized him? Why did it take so long? Richard answered everything with an honesty adapted to their understanding, never lying but also not offering details that might frighten them more. Eventually, Isabel asked in a small voice, "And Clara, is she coming back? We like her a lot. She was the only nice person when you weren't here." Richard smiled for the first time in hours. "Clara is downstairs. She helped Daddy find out the truth and was very brave. Do you want me to ask her to come up?" All three girls nodded enthusiastically, more animation on their faces than Richard had seen in months. He went downstairs and found Clara still, in the ballroom, helping Mrs. Gable organize the chaos left by the interrupted event. "The girls are asking for you," he said simply. Clara followed Richard up the stairs with visible nervousness. When she entered the room, the three girls ran to her just as they had run to their father minutes before. Clara fell to her knees, hugging them with tears streaming down her face. "My little ones, my brave little ones," she whispered, kissing the tops of their heads. "Are you going to stay now?" Amelia asked, looking at Clara with pure hope. "Please don't go away again. We were so scared when she sent you away." Clara looked at Richard over the girls' heads, an unasked question in her eyes. He nodded firmly. "If Clara wants to stay, she is more than welcome. In fact, I would very much like her to stay. The girls need you." Clara dried her tears and smiled at the three of them. "I'm not going anywhere, I promise. I'll be here for you, always." The girls hugged her tighter, and Richard watched the scene with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper he wasn't ready to name yet. That night, for the first time in months, the three girls slept soundly. Richard sat in a chair between their beds, watching them breathe softly, their faces relaxed in dreamless sleep. Mrs. Gable brought him some tea and sat silently beside him for a few minutes. "You did the right thing, Mr. Sterling," the elderly housekeeper said eventually. "It was brave and risky, but you saved those girls. Mrs. Eleanor would be proud." Richard felt tears sting his eyes again. "I hope so, Mrs. Gable. I hope wherever she is, she knows I finally woke up and protected our daughters." Downstairs, Clara had finished cleaning the ballroom and was preparing to return to the room she had occupied before her forced dismissal. Evelyn found her in the hallway. "You were incredibly brave today," the lawyer said. "Many people in your position would have stayed silent out of fear." Clara shrugged modestly. "Those girls deserved someone to fight for them. I couldn't just give up." Evelyn studied the young maid with renewed interest. "Richard is lucky to have you by his side on this journey. And the girls clearly love you deeply." Clara blushed slightly. "They're easy to love. They're sweet and brave despite everything they've suffered." Evelyn nodded thoughtfully before saying her goodbyes. When the house finally fell into complete silence in the early hours of the morning, Richard remained awake, his mind processing the day's events. Victoria was in jail, formal charges would be filed in the morning, and the legal process would run its course. But the legal victory was just the beginning. The real journey would be helping Sophia, Isabel, and Amelia to heal, to reclaim their stolen innocence, to learn that they could trust again. It would be long, difficult, and would likely involve years of therapy and infinite patience. But Richard was ready, and this time he wouldn't be alone. He looked out the window at the gardens where he had spent days in disguise and felt a strange gratitude for that humiliating experience. It had taught him humility, shown him unexpected courage in people he had always considered merely employees, and revealed truths he would never have discovered otherwise. Tomorrow, a new chapter would begin. But for tonight, it was enough that his daughters were safe, that the monster was caged, and that for the first time in a very long time, genuine hope was beating again in the heart of the Sterling family. The first few days after Victoria's arrest were a turbulent mix of relief, adjustment, and painful revelations. Richard cancelled all his professional commitments, delegating urgent responsibilities to trusted partners and postponing anything that could wait. His absolute priority was the girls, and nothing else mattered at that moment. The morning after the confrontation, a medical team specializing in child trauma arrived at the estate. Dr. Paula Miller, a renowned pediatrician recommended by Evelyn, examined Sophia, Isabel, and Amelia with infinite gentleness, explaining each step of the exam in a reassuring way. Clara remained by their side the entire time, holding their little hands when needed, offering comforting words. The results were devastating even for Richard, who had expected the worst. Sophia showed signs of mild malnutrition, her weight below the ideal for her age. Isabel had bruises in various stages of healing, including finger marks on her arms, consistent with violent grabbing. Amelia showed small but unmistakable scars from cigarette burns, as well as scratches on her back that seemed to be the result of being dragged across rough surfaces. All three exhibited signs of severe chronic stress: sleep problems, nervous tics, exaggerated, startle responses to loud noises or sudden movements. Dr. Miller documented everything meticulously, photographing every mark, every scar, creating a medical record that would be crucial evidence in the case against Victoria. Furthermore, she immediately recommended a child psychologist specializing in trauma. Dr. Helen Carter was hired the same day, a woman in her 40s with extensive experience in abuse cases. She began gentle sessions with the girls, using toys and drawings to help them process what they had lived through. Richard watched the first session through a one-way mirror they had temporarily installed in an adapted room at the estate. Seeing his daughters try to express their fears and pains through drawings with dark colors and threatening figures broke his heart all over again. Sophia drew a large dark figure looming over three small, cowering figures. Isabel created an image of a house split in two, one side with a sun and flowers, the other with black clouds and lightning. Amelia simply covered the entire paper with black, pressing the crayon so hard it tore in several places. "It will take time," Dr. Carter said when she spoke with Richard after the session. "They have suffered profound psychological trauma during a critical period of their development, but they are resilient, and with a safe environment, consistent love, and proper therapy, they can recover. They won't be the same as they were before. The trauma has changed them, but they can learn to live fully again." Richard absorbed her words, mentally committing to do whatever was necessary to help his daughters recover. Meanwhile, the legal case against Victoria moved forward quickly. The district attorney's office filed formal charges, including multiple counts of child abuse, assault, document forgery, and conspiracy to commit murder. Evelyn coordinated everything with impressive efficiency. She organized depositions from all the employees who had witnessed the abuse, compiled photographic evidence, and prepared medical reports. Clara spent hours giving a detailed deposition, recounting every incident she had witnessed during the months she worked at the house. Victoria, for her part, hired an expensive lawyer from New York, a man known for defending wealthy clients in difficult cases. His defense strategy was predictable, claiming that Richard had fabricated evidence because he wanted to get rid of an inconvenient wife, that the maids were lying out of loyalty to their wealthy employer, and that the girls were spoiled children who exaggerated normal discipline. But there was a fundamental problem with Victoria's defense. The evidence was simply too overwhelming and came from too many sources. The photographs from her safe showing research on poisons and forged powers of attorney were irrefutable. The medical testimony documenting physical abuse was scientific and objective, and there were dozens of respectable witnesses who had seen the confrontation during the charity dinner, including a judge and the police chief. A bail hearing was set for a week after the arrest, The prosecution argued vehemently against her release, citing the risk of flight given the financial resources Victoria still controlled through her own accounts, and the potential danger to the witnesses, especially the children. The judge agreed, denying bail. Victoria would remain in jail until the trial. During this time, life at the Sterling estate began a slow transformation. Richard established a new routine focused entirely on the girls' well-being. Mornings began with a relaxed breakfast, where they could eat whatever they wanted, without pressure or criticism. There were no more rigid rules about posture or quantity, only gentle encouragement for proper nutrition. Clara took on an unofficial but essential role as the primary caregiver. She woke the girls with gentleness, helped them get dressed, and combed their hair with infinite patience, untangling knots while talking about light and cheerful things. The three naturally gravitated towards her, seeking hugs and comfort that she offered generously. Richard watched the interactions between Clara and his daughters with complex feelings, gratitude certainly for the dedication and genuine love she showed, but also something deeper, an admiration that grew each day as he witnessed her gentle strength, the way she instinctively knew exactly what each girl needed at any given moment. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after Victoria's arrest, Richard found Clara in the garden where she was playing with the three girls. They were making flower crowns, a simple activity, but one filled with the genuine laughter he hadn't heard in months. Sophia was decorating her crown with daisies, Isabel was choosing small roses, and Amelia was mixing all the colors she could find. Clara was teaching them how to intertwine the stems, her nimble fingers demonstrating patience as Isabel tried for the 5th time to connect 2 flowers without success. When she finally managed it, the girl shouted with joy, and Clara hugged her effusively, praising her effort. Richard approached silently, not wanting to interrupt the perfect moment, but Amelia saw him and ran to him, pulling him by the hand. "Daddy, come make a crown with us. Clara taught us, and it's so much fun." He let himself be led, sitting on the grass next to Clara, who smiled shyly when their eyes met. They spent the next hour creating flower crowns. Richard found it surprisingly relaxing, a simple activity that allowed his mind to rest from the constant worries about legal proceedings and recovery. The girls laughed when his crown repeatedly fell apart, and he feigned exaggerated frustration, making them laugh even more. When they finally finished, each of them wore a flower crown, including Richard, who accepted one made collaboratively by his 3 daughters. Clara captured the moment with her phone, taking a picture of Richard surrounded by the girls, all crowned with flowers, smiling genuinely for the first time in months. That night, after the girls were asleep, Richard sought out Clara, who was in the kitchen preparing tea. "Thank you," he said simply, "for today, for every day, for everything. You've brought joy back to them when I didn't even know how to begin." Clara turned, surprised by the intensity in his voice. "Mr. Sterling, you don't need to thank me. I love these girls as if they were my own. Anything I do is because I want to, not out of obligation." He took a step closer, something shifting in the air between them. "I know, and that makes it even more special. You choose to love them, even after everything you've faced because of them." There was a moment of charged silence, both of them aware of the proximity, of the subtle but undeniable shift in their dynamic. Clara was the first to look away, blushing slightly. "The girls asked today if you'll ever get married again." Richard raised his eyebrows. "They did? And what did you say?" "I said it wasn't my place to answer that they should ask their father," Clara replied, nervously fiddling with her teacup. "But I also said that if you did get married again someday, I hoped it would be with someone who truly loved them and wanted what was best for them." Richard smiled softly. "Wise advice. And do you happen to know anyone like that?" Clara looked at him, sensing something different in his tone, but she didn't dare interpret it. "I'm not going to answer that, Mr. Sterling. It wouldn't be appropriate." He nodded, respecting her boundaries but filing the conversation away as something to be revisited when the time was right. "You're right. I'm sorry if I was inappropriate." The following days brought more progress. Sophia started eating larger portions at meals, slowly gaining weight. Isabel had a nightmare only twice in an entire week, a significant improvement compared to the nightly terrors she had been suffering. Amelia began to talk more, her small voice growing in confidence each day. Dr. Carter reported advances in therapy. The girls were starting to verbalize their fears instead of just drawing them. Sophia admitted she was afraid the mean stepmother would come back, and Richard repeatedly assured her he would never allow that. Isabel confessed she felt guilty for not telling her daddy sooner, and he held her, patiently explaining that it wasn't her fault, that the adults should have protected her better. Amelia, in the most emotional session, revealed that she thought her daddy didn't love them anymore because he was away so much. Richard cried openly when Dr. Carter told him. This, devastated to realize how deeply his work-related absences had fueled Victoria's manipulations. He made a promise that day to completely restructure his priorities. Business could be managed remotely or by trusted partners. Travel would be drastically minimized. His daughters needed to know, through actions, not just words, that they were the absolute priority in his life. A month after Victoria's arrest, a preliminary hearing was scheduled. Richard attended the court with Clara by his side as a key witness. It was the first time he had seen his ex-wife since the night of the confrontation. Victoria entered the room, wearing an orange prison uniform, a stark contrast to the gala dresses she used to wear. She seemed to have aged years in weeks, her face pale without elaborate makeup, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She shot a look of pure hatred at Richard as she entered, but completely avoided looking at Clara. The hearing was brief, mostly procedural, setting a timeline for the trial which would be in 3 months. The prosecution presented a summary of the evidence. The defense made predictably weak objections, and the judge confirmed the case would proceed. As they left the courthouse, Clara trembled slightly. "Seeing her again even behind that table gave me chills," she admitted. Richard placed a comforting hand on her back. "I know. But she has no more power over any of us. She's just a bitter woman facing the consequences of her choices." They returned to the estate where the girls were waiting anxiously. Mrs. Gable had distracted them with cookies and cartoons, but they ran to hug their father and Clara as soon as they arrived. Richard held them tight, breathing in the childish scent of strawberry shampoo and gradually restored innocence. That night, as he was putting the 3 of them to bed, Sophia asked a question that would change everything. "Daddy, can Clara be our new real mommy? We like her a lot and she's always nice to us." Richard looked at 3 pairs of hopeful eyes and felt his heart swell with love and the possibility of a future that was beginning to take shape in his mind. Sophia's question hung in the air like a delicate melody awaiting resolution. Richard looked at his 3 daughters, their hopeful faces illuminated by the soft light of the moon-shaped lamp that decorated their room. He sat on the edge of the shared bed, pulling the 3 of them close in a collective hug. "You really like Clara that much?" he asked softly, wanting to understand the depth of their feelings. All 3 nodded vigorously, Isabel being the first to speak. "She's the best person in the whole world, Daddy. She makes heart-shaped pancakes and always knows when we're sad even when we don't say anything. And she sings to us when we have nightmares," added Amelia, pulling the blanket up to her chin. "She sings that song about little birds that her mommy used to sing to her when she was little. It makes me feel safe." Sophia completed the chorus of praise. "And she plays with us for real, not just pretends to play while looking at the clock. And she hugs us a lot, a whole lot." Richard felt emotion tighten his throat. Children were natural observers of authenticity, and they clearly recognized the genuine love Clara offered. "I understand, girls, and you know that I like Clara very much too. She's a very special person who did very brave things to protect you. But these things take time. They need to happen naturally. I can't just decide that Clara will be your mother without talking to her about it." Isabel frowned thoughtfully. "But do you like her, Daddy? The way you liked our first mommy?" Richard paused, carefully considering his answer. His love for Eleanor had been built over years, matured through shared experiences and joint dreams. What he felt for Clara was different, born of extraordinary circumstances, forged in the fire of shared adversity. "I like Clara in a different way than I liked Mommy Eleanor," he answered honestly, but that doesn't mean I like her less. It just means that every special person in our life holds a unique place. Clara is brave, kind, and she loves you in a way that impresses me every day. That counts for a lot. So you're going to ask her if she wants to be our mommy? Sophia insisted with direct childish logic. Richard laughed softly. I'll think about the best way to do that, okay? But for now you need to sleep. It's way past your bedtime. The girls protested lightly, but eventually settled down, kissing him goodnight with tight hugs. Going downstairs, Richard found Clara still awake in the living room, folding the girls' clean laundry. She had developed a habit of doing small household chores even after Richard insisted multiple times that she was no longer simply an employee, that she could relax. But Clara had explained that she liked to keep her hands busy, that she found the activities comforting. Can I help? Richard offered, sitting next to her on the sofa. Of course, Clara replied, handing him a pile of small T-shirts to fold. They worked in companionable silence for a few minutes before Richard gathered the courage to address the subject, weighing on his mind. The girls asked an interesting question today, he began casually. They wanted to know if you could be their new mother. Clara froze mid-fold of a little pink dress, her hands stopping in the air. She didn't look at him when she replied, her voice carefully controlled. And what did you say? I said that these things take time, that I couldn't just decide something like that without talking to you, Richard answered. But I also didn't say no. Clara finally met his gaze, her brown eyes searching his. Mr. Sterling, we need to be careful. The girls are vulnerable, right? Now looking for stability and security. They might be confusing gratitude and the need for a maternal figure with something more permanent. Richard placed the T-shirt he was folding on the pile and turned to face her completely. And you, Clara? Are you confusing anything? Or are your feelings for them genuine and lasting? She didn't hesitate. My feelings for them are absolutely genuine. I would love these girls, even if I never worked in this house, even if you never existed. They've touched my heart in a way I can't explain. And what about me? Richard asked softly, taking a step he had been considering for weeks. Are your feelings towards me purely professional, just a loyal employee, or is there something more? Clara blushed deeply, looking away. This isn't an appropriate conversation, Mr. Sterling. I'm an employee in your home, you're my boss, and you're still technically married even if you're in the process of an annulment. Legally, perhaps, Richard said, but we know that the marriage to Victoria was a fraud from the start. She deceived me, used me, planned to murder me. That's not a real marriage. And as for you being an employee, I've told you several times that you are much more than that. You're an ally, a friend, a person who risked everything for my daughters when I was too blind to see the truth. Clara stood up, clear agitation in her movements. Mr. Sterling, I can't have this conversation right now. It's too soon, too complicated. You're grateful and you're confusing gratitude with other feelings. In a few months, when everything has calmed down, you'll realize that I'm just the person who was in the right place at the right time. Richard also stood, approaching her carefully so as not to invade her personal space. Clara, look at me. She reluctantly complied. I'm not confusing anything. I watched you for days when I was in disguise. I saw how you treat my daughters when you think no one important is looking. I saw your courage when you confronted Victoria knowing you would lose your job. I've seen your genuine heart in every small act of kindness. And since then, he continued, I've seen how you've naturally taken on the role of caregiver, not out of obligation, but out of real love. I've seen how my daughter's eyes light up when you enter the room. I've seen how you make them laugh, how you instinctively know what each one needs. I'm not asking for anything today. I'm not pressuring you. I'm just saying that when you're ready for this conversation, when the time feels right, I want you to know that my feelings are real. Clara had tears in her eyes now. What if I mess everything up? What if I'm not good enough? I come from a simple family from the countryside. I don't have a formal education beyond high school. I know nothing about running a house like this or being the wife of an important businessman. Richard smiled gently. You've already proven to be exactly the kind of person my family needs. I don't want someone who knows how to organize charity dinners. I want someone who knows how to make flower crowns with children. I don't want empty sophistication, I want a genuine heart. Before Clara could reply, they heard a sound from upstairs. A nightmare. They both recognized it immediately and ran for the stairs. Arriving at the girls' room, they found Amelia sitting up in bed crying. Isabel and Sophia awake, trying to comfort her. Clara got to there first, wrapping Amelia in a protective hug. "Shh, my little one, I'm here. It was just a bad dream, it can't hurt you." Amelia clung to her, sobbing about the mean stepmother coming back and taking everyone away. Richard sat on the other side, stroking his daughter's hair. "No one is taking anyone, Amelia. Daddy is here, Clara is here, and that woman will never get near you again." Sophia and Isabel also moved closer, creating a protective circle around Amelia. All together they rocked gently, Clara singing softly that song about little birds she had mentioned. Gradually, Amelia's breathing calmed, her sobs subsided and she began to relax. When she finally fell back asleep, still nestled between Clara and Richard, the other two had already drifted off as well. Clara tried to move gently so as not to wake them, but Richard held her hand. "Stay," he whispered, "just for a few minutes. They sleep better when you're near." They sat there in the dim light of the room, watching the three girls sleep peacefully, their hands still intertwined between them. It was a moment of pure intimacy, nothing romantic or dramatic, just two adults united in a shared love for children who needed them. Eventually they whispered goodnight and separated for their own rooms, but something fundamental had changed. It was no longer a question of if something would develop between them, but when and how they would allow their growing feelings to manifest. The following days brought more moments like this, small interactions laden with unspoken meaning. Richard would watch Clara play with the girls and feel a warmth in his chest. Clara would catch Richard teaching Isabel to ride a bike with infinite patience and feel her heart race. Mrs. Gable watched it all, with the wise eyes of someone who had lived many years. One afternoon she found Clara in the kitchen preparing the girls' favorite dinner, pasta, with a sauce they made together. "You know he's in love with you," the housekeeper said bluntly. Clara nearly dropped the spoon she was holding. "Mrs. Gable, don't be silly." The older woman laughed. "I'm not silly, child. I've known that man since he was a baby. I know how he looks at a woman he loves. I saw it with Mrs. Eleanor, and he looks at you in exactly the same way, only different, too. With Eleanor it was a young, eager love. With you it's a mature love, born of respect and admiration." Clara sat down heavily on a kitchen stool. "I'm so scared, Mrs. Gable. What if I'm not enough? What if I ruin things with the girls?" The housekeeper placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "My dear, you have already proven to be more than enough. Those girls love you with a purity that children only show for truly special people. And Richard sees you not just as the savior of his daughters, but as the extraordinary woman you are. And I really care about him," Clara admitted in a low voice. "Not just because he's my boss or the girl's father. I care about him as a man, as a person. I like hearing him laugh. I like how patient he is with the girls even when he's tired. I like how he's working so hard to be a better father." "Then stop fighting it," Mrs. Gable advised. "Let it happen naturally. The late Mrs. Eleanor would be happy knowing her daughters have a loving mother and their father has a true partner." That night, there was a special dinner. Richard announced that the new hotel in Charleston was finally ready for its grand opening, but that he wouldn't be going personally because he didn't want to be away from the girls. His partners would travel to represent him. The three of them applauded the decision, with Sophia declaring that Daddy staying home was the best present possible. After dinner, they had a movie night in the living room, watching an animated film the girls had chosen. Richard and Clara sat on the large sofa with the three girls spread out between them, popcorn in big bowls, soft blankets, creating a cozy nest. In the middle of the movie, Amelia fell asleep with her head in Clara's lap. Sophia was snuggled against Richard's side. Isabel, ever the observer, looked at both adults and whispered, "You two look like a real mommy and daddy like this. I like it." Richard and Clara exchanged a look over the girls' heads, a small but significant smile passing between them. Maybe, just maybe, the future the girls imagined wasn't so impossible after all. Maybe a genuine love grown from shared adversity was exactly the kind of foundation upon which a strong family could be rebuilt. And as the movie continued and the girls slept safely between them, Richard and Clara allowed themselves to imagine the possibilities of tomorrow. 3 months had passed since Victoria's arrest, and the trial date had finally arrived. Richard woke before dawn, nervousness and anticipation preventing him from sleeping. It would be the definitive day, the moment when justice would be officially served, or not. Although Evelyn repeatedly assured him that the evidence was overwhelming, a part of him still feared that some legal technicality would allow Victoria to escape the full consequences. Clara knocked softly on his bedroom door at 6 in the morning, bringing strong coffee just as she knew he liked it. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked, and he shook his head no. She sat in the armchair near the window. "The girls are anxious. They know today is an important day, even if they don't understand all the details." Richard took a sip of the coffee, savoring the comforting bitterness. "Is Mrs. Gable going to stay with them while we're at the courthouse?" Clara nodded. "Yes, and Dr. Carter will also come to spend the afternoon with them, to do a special therapy session in case they need to process the day's emotions. We've planned distracting activities, painting and gardening." The trial was set to begin at 9 in the morning at the Ashton Falls courthouse. Richard wore a dark suit. Clara chose a simple but elegant dress in a navy blue shade. Evelyn would pick them up at 8, ensuring they arrived with plenty of time. Before leaving, Richard went to the girls' room. The three were already awake, sitting together on the bed as they often did when they were nervous. "Daddy will be back soon," he promised, hugging each one. "And when I come back, that mean woman will never be able to hurt anyone again. They're going to make sure she stays away forever." "Is she going to real prison?" Isabel asked with wide eyes. "Like in the movies?" Richard nodded. "Yes, my love. For a very, very long time. Because adults who hurt children need to learn that it is never, ever acceptable." Sophia held his hand tightly. "You promise she'll never come back here?" "I promise with all my heart," he answered solemnly. The courthouse was packed when they arrived. The case had attracted considerable media attention, both locally and even nationally. It wasn't every day that a millionaire businessman's wife was accused of conspiracy to commit murder and systematic child abuse. Journalists with cameras and microphones surrounded the entrance, asking questions that Richard and Clara ignored, quickly heading inside escorted by security guards Evelyn had arranged. Inside the courtroom, Richard saw familiar faces. Mrs. Gable was there, despite having said she would stay with the girls. Another employee had taken on that role to allow the housekeeper to testify. Several other maids who worked at the estate were also present, ready to give their statements. Chief Corbin sat in the area reserved for prosecution witnesses. Then Victoria entered, escorted by guards. The months in prison had transformed the once impeccable woman. Her blonde hair was dull, pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her face, bare of makeup, showed lines of stress and anger. She wore formal clothing provided by her defense attorney, an attempt to present her as respectable, but nothing could hide the fundamental change in her appearance. When she looked at Richard, there was no longer any attempt at charm or manipulation, just pure hatred and resentment. Clara instinctively moved closer to Richard, and he placed a comforting hand on her back. Judge Ralph Anderson entered, and everyone rose. He was a man in his 60s with a reputation for being strict but fair. He looked over his reading glasses at the crowded room before banging his gavel. "This court is now in session. We will proceed with the trial of the state versus Victoria Blackwood Sterling." The prosecutor, Paul Garrison, a competent man Evelyn had recommended and who had taken on the case with fierce dedication, presented his opening arguments. He spoke eloquently about how Victoria had calculatedly deceived Richard Sterling, seduced him during a vulnerable period after the loss of his wife, and then systematically tortured his innocent stepdaughters while plotting to murder her husband to inherit his fortune. "The evidence will be irrefutable," Prosecutor Garrison declared. "We have medical documentation of physical abuse. We have testimony from multiple individuals who witnessed the defendant's cruelty. We have documents from her own safe proving the conspiracy. And we have the testimony of Mr. Sterling himself, who personally observed her behavior for days when she thought she was unobserved, the defense attorney, Dr. Michael Fonseca, tried to build a counter-narrative. He alleged that Richard had fabricated evidence because he wanted to get rid of a wife who had discovered his extramarital affairs. He suggested that the maids were lying out of loyalty to their wealthy employer. He argued that the marks on the children could be from normal accidents of active childhood. But the argument sounded hollow even to casual observers. The evidence was simply too much and too specific. The first day of the trial focused on prosecution witnesses. Clara was called first, her steps firm, but her hands trembling slightly as she swore to tell the truth. Under gentle questioning from Prosecutor Garrison, she recounted the months of observation, starting from when she was hired, and saw the gradual transformation of the girls from cheerful children into faded beings. She described specific punishments, how Victoria would force the girls to stand facing a wall for hours, how she would deny them food, how she would tie their wrists with silk scarves as punishment. When she got to the account of the scene on the staircase, when Victoria had dragged Isabel by her hair, Clara's voice faltered, but she remained steady. "She slapped me across the face when I tried to defend Isabel," Clara said, unconsciously, touching the cheek where the mark had remained for days. "But I don't regret speaking up. Those girls deserve to have someone defend them." During cross-examination, Dr. Fonseca tried to discredit Clara, suggesting she had invented stories because she wanted Richard for herself. Clara maintained her composure. "I didn't invent anything. Every word I said is the truth, and there are other people who saw the same things. I'm not doing this for personal gain. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do." Mrs. Gable testified next, her voice trembling, but determined as she confirmed Clara's observations. "I've worked for the Sterling family for over 20 years. I watched that man grow up. I saw him build a life with Mrs. Eleanor. I saw the birth of those 3 precious girls, and I saw that woman systematically destroy it all." Tears streamed down the elderly housekeeper's face as she described the change in the girls, how the laughter disappeared and the fears multiplied. Other maids testified, each adding a piece to the mosaic of abuse. Jane spoke of the marks she had seen on the girls' arms. Lucy described hearing frequent screams and crying. The driver who took the girls to school reported how they became increasingly quiet and withdrawn over the months. Dr. Paula Miller presented the medical evidence, enlarged photographs showing bruises, burn marks, and signs of malnutrition. She explained in clinical but accessible terms how the injuries were consistent with deliberate abuse, not accidents. The jurors and the audience were visibly disturbed by the images. Dr. Helen Carter testified about the girls' psychological state, describing the deep trauma they had suffered, the nightmares, anxiety, and fear of abandonment. "I have worked with traumatized children for 15 years, she said. The Sterling sisters case is one of the most severe I have encountered in terms of systematic psychological abuse. The second day brought Richard's testimony. He recounted under oath how he had suspected something was wrong, how he had decided to disguise himself as a gardener, and everything he had witnessed during those days. He described seeing Victoria humiliate the girls for tiny mistakes, force them into long punishments, and psychologically terrorize them. When he got to the part about discovering the safe, an absolute silence fell over the room. "I found research on undetectable poisons," Richard said, his voice firm but laden with emotion. "Forged. Powers of attorney with my signature. Insurance policies I never authorized. And vials with unidentified substances, along with notes on dosages." Dr. Fonseca tried to question why Richard had waited so long to act, suggesting he had had time to fabricate evidence. Richard looked at him directly. "I waited because I needed irrefutable proof. I needed to ensure that when I acted, my ex-wife would have no way to escape, no way to spin the narrative, and also because, to my eternal shame, a part of me didn't want to believe that the person I trusted with my daughters could be capable of such evil." Evelyn presented all the photographs Richard had taken of the documents in the safe. Experts confirmed that the powers of attorney were forged. A toxicology specialist identified the substances found in the vials as compounds that could cause symptoms similar to a heart attack or stroke if administered correctly. The third day was the defense's turn to present its case. Dr. Fonseca called a psychiatrist who claimed that Victoria suffered from post-traumatic stress from a previous abusive relationship, which would explain her behavior. But under cross-examination from the prosecution, the psychiatrist admitted he had only spoken with Victoria twice and had based his diagnosis primarily on what she herself had said. Victoria finally testified in her own defense. It was a disaster for her case. She tried to maintain her composure, but under questioning from Prosecutor Garrison, she contradicted herself repeatedly. When confronted with specific evidence, she reacted with anger instead of rational explanations. When the prosecutor asked about the scene on the staircase with Isabel, Victoria exploded. That girl was insolent, always questioning, always disrespecting. Someone needed to teach her discipline. Dr. Fonseca tried to intervene, but the damage was done. The jury had seen a glimpse of the real Victoria, a person without empathy or remorse. Closing arguments were on the fourth day. Prosecutor Garrison methodically summarized the evidence, building an irrefutable case. Dr. Fonseca made a final effort to create reasonable doubt, but it was clearly an impossible task. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours before returning with a verdict. Guilty on all counts, multiple counts of child abuse, assault, document forgery, and conspiracy to commit murder. When the verdict was read, Victoria turned pale but showed no emotion beyond tightening her lips into a thin line. Richard felt Clara squeeze, his hand holding it tightly. They looked at each other, tears of relief in both their eyes. Sentencing would be pronounced in a week, but everyone knew it would be severe. Judge Anderson was known for punishing crimes against children to the fullest extent of the law. Leaving the courthouse surrounded by a frenzied media, Richard made a brief statement. "Justice was served today. My daughters can finally begin to heal, knowing that the person who hurt them will pay for her crimes. I thank everyone who had the courage to speak the truth." Back at the estate, the girls were waiting anxiously. "Is it over, Daddy?" Sophia asked, running into his arms. "Is she going to stay away?" Richard lifted her up, hugging her tightly. "It's over, my princess. She was found guilty. She will never be able to hurt you or any other child again." The three of them burst into tears of relief, hugging both Richard and Clara. It was the end of a terrible chapter and the beginning of true healing. The week between the verdict and the sentencing passed in a haze of mixed emotions. Richard felt immense relief knowing Victoria had been found guilty, but also a nervous anticipation, waiting to know exactly how long she would spend in prison. Evelyn had explained that with the severity of the crimes, especially the conspiracy to commit murder combined with systematic child abuse, the sentence would likely be 15 to 20 years at a minimum. The girls, sensing the adults' tension, even without fully understanding the legal details, became more clingy than ever to both Richard and Clara. Sophia developed a habit of checking multiple times a day that her daddy was still at home, popping into his office just to confirm his presence. Isabel asked constant questions about when they would be absolutely sure the mean stepmother was locked up. Amelia simply refused to sleep alone, needing either Clara or Richard to stay in the room until she fell into a deep sleep. Dr. Carter explained that this was a normal reaction to trauma, a need for constant reaffirmation of safety. With time and consistency, the anxiety would diminish. But for now, patience and presence were the best medicine. During these days, Richard also noticed a subtle but significant change in how the girls treated Clara. It was no longer just affection or dependence. It was something deeper, more definitive. They began calling her Clara Mommy in conversations among themselves, a combination he accidentally overheard while passing their room. Isabel was explaining something to Amelia using the phrase, "Clara Mommy said that when we're scared we can take 3 deep breaths." Sophia added, "And Clara Mommy always knows how to make the hurt better with a little kiss and a special band-aid." Richard paused in the hallway, his heart aching as he heard how naturally they had adopted a maternal title for the woman who had become a central figure in their lives. That night, after the girls were asleep, he found Clara in the library where she often read before bed. She was curled up in a large armchair near the fireplace, engrossed in a novel she had taken from Eleanor's extensive collection. "May I interrupt?" Richard asked from the doorway. Clara looked up and smiled, marking her page. "Of course, always." Richard came in and sat in the armchair beside hers. "I heard the girls today. They're calling you Clara Mommy among themselves." Clara blushed slightly. "I know. I noticed a few days ago. I tried to correct them gently, to explain that I'm just a friend. Who takes care of them? But Sophia said that friend who takes care of us is too long and Clara Mommy is easier." Richard laughed softly. The irrefutable logic of a 6-year-old. There was a comfortable pause before Clara continued, her voice more serious. "Mr. Sterling, we need to talk about what happens next, after the sentencing, after everything is really over legally, about my role here, about the future." Richard leaned forward, attentive. "I'm listening." Clara put her book aside, gathering her thoughts. "I know the girls want me around, and I want to be around more than I can express. But I also need to be realistic about the situation. You are a wealthy, important man with a social position. I'm a maid from the countryside with no formal education. People will talk, they will judge. It could affect your business, the girl's reputation when they grow up." Richard shook his head firmly. "Clara, if I learned anything from the disaster of my marriage to Victoria, it's that appearances and social opinions mean nothing compared to genuine character and true love. Victoria had all the formal education, all the social sophistication, and she used it all to deceive and destroy. You have a pure heart and real courage. I know which one I prefer." "But what about your daughters?" Clara insisted. "They deserve stability, not complications. If we get closer, and then it doesn't work out, they will suffer another devastating loss. They've already lost their biological mother. They were betrayed by a cruel stepmother. I can't risk hurting them too." Richard reached out, taking her hand. "That's why we'll go slow. That's why we won't rush anything. But we also won't deny what's growing between us out of fear of what could go wrong. Clara, you make me want to be a better man, a better father. When I look at you with my daughters, I see a future I didn't think was possible after Eleanor was gone." "And I see that future too," Clara admitted in a low voice, "but it scares me. The possibility of failing, of not being enough, terrifies me." "You have never failed at anything that matters," Richard replied. "You've proven that repeatedly. Now you just need to believe in yourself as much as we believe in you." They were interrupted by Sophia appearing in the library doorway, dragging her favorite blanket. "I had a nightmare. Again. Can you come back to the room with me?" Clara and Richard exchanged a look and stood up immediately, following the little girl back to the shared room where Isabel and Amelia were also awake. They spent the next hour reading stories, singing soft songs, simply being present until the 3 girls relaxed back into a deep sleep. When they finally left, leaving the door ajar and the hallway light on, Richard whispered, "See, you're already their mother in every way but legal name. And as for the name, we can sort that out when you're ready." Clara didn't reply, but she squeezed his hand briefly before heading to her own room. It was enough for now, this silent acknowledgement of future possibilities. The day of the sentencing arrived a week after the verdict. The courtroom was once again packed, but this time the atmosphere was different, more somber and definitive. Everyone knew this was the final act of the drama that had captured Ashton Falls's attention. Victoria was brought into the room wearing the same formal attire from the trial, but her appearance had deteriorated even further. Deep, dark circles marked her face, her shoulders were slumped in, a defeat she had finally accepted. She did not look at Richard or Clara when she entered, keeping her eyes fixed on the defense table. Judge Anderson entered, and the room fell into absolute silence. Before pronouncing the sentence, he allowed the victims to speak if they wished. Prosecutor Garrison invited Richard to the stand. Richard stood, walking to the front with firm steps. He cleared his throat before beginning. "Your Honor, I bring to this court not just my own voice, but the voice of 3 little girls who cannot be here today. Sophia, Isabel, and Amelia Sterling were 6 years old when the person who should have protected them decided to torture them physically and psychologically." He continued, his voice steady but laden with emotion. "These girls lost their biological mother years ago to a terrible illness. They were vulnerable, seeking a mother's love. And I, in my blindness and my desire to give them a mother figure, brought a predator into our home. For that, I blame myself every day. But the real blame, the real responsibility, belongs to the woman sitting there who calculatedly deceived, manipulated and abused innocent children. Richard turned to face Victoria directly. You stole their laughter. You stole their innocence. You stole years that should have been filled with joy and discovery. And beyond that, you plan to murder me to steal everything I've built. Not out of need, not out of passion, but out of cold, calculated greed. He turned back to the judge. I ask the court that the sentence reflect the gravity of these crimes, that it ensures my daughters grow up knowing that justice was served. When he returned to his seat, Clara squeezed his hand. The prosecutor then invited Clara if she wished to speak. She hesitated, but stood, walking nervously to the front. Your Honor, she began, her voice trembling but gradually gaining strength. I worked in the Sterling home for a year. For months I witnessed the systematic abuse of 3 precious children. I saw girls who should have been playing and laughing be reduced to frightened shadows. I saw their spirits being broken day after day. I tried to protect them within my limitations, Clara continued, but I was afraid to speak out because I knew if I was fired, they would be left completely alone with that woman. When I finally found the courage to confront the abuse directly, I was physically assaulted and thrown out. Today I speak not just for myself, but for every person who sees injustice happening and fights against fear to do what is right. She turned to Victoria briefly. You had every opportunity in the world. A loving family welcomed you, trusted you, opened their home and their hearts to you, and you betrayed all of it in the cruelest way possible. I hope the years in prison give you time to reflect on the monster you became. Dr. Fonseca made a final attempt to appeal for leniency, arguing that Victoria had the potential for rehabilitation, that a harsh sentence would be disproportionate. But Judge Anderson was clearly not convinced. When it came time to pronounce the sentence, the judge looked directly at Victoria. Mrs. Blackwood Sterling, your crimes are among the most heinous I have presided over in this court. You abused a position of trust to systematically torture innocent children. You planned the murder of your husband out of greed. You have shown zero remorse or empathy. The judge's voice resonated through the room. I hereby sentence you to 20 years in prison for conspiracy, to commit murder, an additional 10 years for aggravated child abuse to be served consecutively, plus 5 years for document forgery and assault, a total of 35 years with no possibility of parole for the first 15. Gasps echoed through the room. It was a severe sentence even by the standards of serious crimes. Victoria turned even paler, finally showing a real emotional reaction. 35 years meant she would be over 60 when she got out, the life she had known completely destroyed. Furthermore, the judge continued, I order you to pay full restitution for the costs of the victim's medical and psychological treatment, and I am issuing a permanent restraining order, prohibiting any contact with Mr. Sterling or his daughters. The gavel came down with absolute finality. This court is adjourned. Guards led Victoria out. She finally broke into sobs of impotent rage and despair. Richard watched her go without feeling satisfaction or triumph, only a deep relief that this terrible chapter was finally closed. Outside the courthouse, they faced the media again. Richard made a brief statement. Justice has been served today. My daughters can grow up knowing the person who hurt them has paid a just price. We now focus on healing, on rebuilding a strong family based on true love and trust. I thank everyone again who supported my family through this ordeal. Back at the estate, they found the girls waiting with Mrs. Gable, clearly anxious. Richard knelt to be at their level. It's really over this time, girls. She has been sentenced to many, many years in prison. When you are grown-ups, she will still be there. You never have to be afraid again. Sophia hugged him tightly. Can we be happy again now, Daddy? Can we be a real family? Richard looked over, the girls' heads at Clara. Yes, my princess. Now we can really start to build our family the right way this time. And when Isabel asked if Clara was going to stay forever, and Richard saw the pure hope in his 3 daughters' eyes, he knew it was time to stop hesitating and start building the future they all deserved. 6 months had passed since Victoria's sentencing. Spring had arrived in the Hudson Valley Mountains, covering the gardens of the Sterling estate with an explosion of colors and fragrances that seemed to symbolize the rebirth happening inside the house as, well, the changes were visible in every corner, in every smile, in every moment of genuine joy that had replaced the oppressive silence that had dominated for so long. Sophia had regained not only her lost weight, but also her vibrant personality. She was once again the most talkative of the three, filling the house with elaborate stories and endless questions about everything she observed. Her crystal-clear laughter echoed through the corridors, a sound Richard never tired of hearing. Dr. Carter reported that the girl had shown remarkable progress in therapy, processing her trauma in a healthy way and rediscovering her trust in the adults around her. Isabel had developed a love for gardening, spending hours with Richard and Clara planting flowers and vegetables in a bed they had created especially for her. The girl who once feared asking questions now bombarded everyone with curiosity about how plants grew, why some needed more sun than others, and when they could harvest the tomatoes she had planted. Richard saw in this renewed interest a sign of deep healing, a reconnection with the joy of discovery that Victoria had almost completely destroyed. Amelia, the most sensitive, still had occasional nightmares, but the frequency had decreased dramatically. She now slept through the night at least 5 times a week, and when she woke up frightened, she no longer froze in silent terror. She would call for Clara or Daddy with the confidence that they would come, that they would be there to comfort her. She was also developing an impressive artistic talent, creating drawings that had shifted from dark compositions to landscapes full of color, smiling families, and houses surrounded by flowering gardens. Clara had transformed as well, blossoming in the role she had assumed in the family. She was no longer a hesitant maid worried about appropriate boundaries. She was a confident and loving maternal presence, making decisions about the girls' routines, participating in meetings with teachers, and even offering opinions on business decisions Richard brought home. He valued her perspective, the way she saw things through a lens of practical compassion that balanced his tendency for purely strategic thinking. The relationship between Richard and Clara had evolved naturally over these months. It began with longer conversations after the girls were asleep, sharing stories of their respective childhoods, dreams for the future, fears and hopes. It progressed to occasional dinners for just the two of them when Mrs. Gable stayed with the girls, stolen moments to get to know each other as adults independent of the children. Richard discovered that he loved the way Clara laughed, a genuine and contagious sound. He loved how she bit her lower lip when concentrating on something, how she hummed while cooking, how her eyes sparkled when she talked about the girls. Clara confessed that she admired his dedication to his daughters, how he worked to be a better father every day, how he wasn't afraid to admit when he was wrong and ask for help, to do things differently. There was a definitive moment 3 months after the sentencing when everything changed between them. They were in the garden at dusk, watching the girls play hide-and-seek among the trees. The golden light of the sunset painted everything in warm tones, and the children's laughter created a perfect soundtrack. Richard had looked at Clara, seeing how the sun illuminated her face, highlighting the kindness in every feature, and he had simply known. It was no longer a matter of if or when, but of how to make official what his heart had decided long ago. He took her hand, intertwining their fingers, and when she looked up in surprise, he saw the same certainty reflected in her eyes. "I love you," he had said simply, not as gratitude or admiration or any other complicated feeling. "I love you as a woman, as a person, as the future I want to build by my side." Clara had tears in her eyes when she replied, "I love you too. I'm still scared, but I love you too much to let fear win." They kissed then, a first kiss, tender and full of promise, sealing the feelings that had been growing through shared adversity and healing. When they parted, they heard giggles and discovered 3 little girls watching from behind the bushes, huge smiles on their happy faces. "Finally," Sophia had shouted, emerging from her hiding spot. "We were waiting for you to realize you love each other." Isabel and Amelia ran to hug them, and the moment turned into a spontaneous celebration of a family that had chosen to form, not by blood or obligation, but by genuine love and a conscious decision to stay together. Now 6 months since Victoria's imprisonment, and 3 since that kiss in the garden, Richard was about to take the final step in the complete reconstruction of his family. He had talked extensively with Evelyn about the legal aspects, with Dr. Carter about the emotional impact on the girls, and most importantly, with Clara herself about whether she was ready. Today was to be a special day, the last Saturday of spring, and Richard had organized a celebration in the estate's garden. Officially, it was the triplets' 7th birthday party, but there was a surprise element that only he, Mrs. Gable, and Evelyn knew about. The garden was decorated with thousands of flowers, not the expensive, formal arrangements Victoria would have insisted on, but cheerful, colourful compositions that the girls themselves had helped choose. There were tables with their favourite foods, an elaborate cake decorated with the princesses Isabel adored, a face-painting station that Amelia had requested, and a small stage where a magician would perform. Guests began to arrive at noon. They were not the social elite Victoria had cultivated, but genuine people who truly cared about the family. The girls' teachers, classmates with their parents, loyal staff from the estate, a few of Richard's business partners who had become true friends over the years. Dr. Carter was there with her husband, as was Dr. Miller. Even Chief Corbin and Judge Davies attended, bringing generous gifts. Sophia, Isabel, and Amelia were radiant in dresses they had chosen themselves, different colours for each for the first time in years, as Clara had suggested they express their individuality. Sophia in bright yellow, Isabel in emerald green, Amelia in soft pink. They ran through the garden playing with friends, their laughter filling the air with the most beautiful music Richard had ever heard. Clara circulated among the guests with a natural grace she had developed, chatting easily, ensuring everyone was comfortable. She wore a simple but beautiful sky-blue dress, her hair loose in the waves Richard loved. When their eyes met across the crowd, she would smile in a way that made his heart race. After the cake and presents, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Richard stepped onto the small stage. The guests gathered, conversations quieting in anticipation. The 3 girls sat in the front row, with Clara beside them. "Thank you all for coming to celebrate this special day for my daughters," Richard began, his voice projecting clearly. "This past year has been a journey none of us expected, filled with challenges that tested our strength and revealed truths about who really matters in our lives." He looked at Clara, who was watching him with a curious expression. "I've learned that family isn't defined by blood or social status, but by the brave hearts that choose to love, protect, and stay together even in the darkest circumstances. I learned this by watching an extraordinary woman risk everything to defend 3 little girls she barely knew." Clara began to blush, realizing where the speech was heading. Richard stepped down from the stage and walked to her, extending his hand. She took it hesitantly, rising as he led her to the center of everyone's attention. "Clara," Richard said, turning to face her directly, "you taught me that real courage doesn't come from power or wealth, but from doing what's right even when it's hard and scary. You brought laughter back to my daughters when I didn't even know where to start. You showed me how to love better, how to be a better father, how to be a better man." He knelt then, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. Gasps and excited murmurs rippled through the crowd. Sophia, Isabel, and Amelia jumped from their chairs, hugging each other excitedly. Clara brought a hand to her mouth, tears already beginning to stream. "You are already my daughter's mother in every way that matters," Richard continued, opening the box to reveal a simple but beautiful ring, white gold with a modest stone, elegant without being ostentatious. "Now I'm asking you to officially be my wife, my partner, the foundation of the family we are rebuilding together. Clara, will you marry me?" Clara was crying, openly now, nodding vigorously before she could even form the words. "Yes," she finally managed to say. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Richard slid the ring onto her finger and stood, kissing her as the guests applauded and cheered. The 3 girls ran to hug them both, creating a circle of love and joy. When they finally parted, Sophia shouted what all three were thinking. "Now Clara is going to be our real mommy. Can we call her Mom?" Clara knelt to be at their level, hugging all three. "You can call me whatever you want, my loves, Mom, Clara, Mommy, or just Clara. The title doesn't matter. What matters is that we love each other and will always be together." The celebration continued until night fell completely, the garden illuminated by hundreds of fairy lights that created a magical atmosphere. When the last guests had left and the girls were finally in bed, exhausted but happy, Richard and Clara sat on the stone bench in the garden where it had all begun months ago. "Are you sure?" Clara asked, nervously playing with her new ring. "Sure that this is what you want, that I'm ready for this?" Richard pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "I have never been more sure of anything in my entire life. You are exactly what this family needs, exactly what I need." They were married 2 months later in an intimate ceremony in the same gardens, with Sophia, Isabel and Amelia as proud flower girls. It was not the elaborate social event Richard's first wedding had been, but a genuine celebration surrounded by the people who truly mattered. When they exchanged the vows they had written themselves, there wasn't a dry eye among the guests. The following years brought continued healing and growing joy. The girls thrived, each developing a unique personality while maintaining their special triplet connection. Sophia became a natural leader, Isabel discovered a passion for natural sciences, and Amelia blossomed as an artist. All three called Clara Mom without hesitation, and the relationship they built was deep and genuine. Richard completely restructured his priorities, delegating more responsibilities and working primarily from home. He discovered he could be a successful businessman without sacrificing time with his family, that his presence was worth more than any contract or business expansion. Clara flourished in her role as a wife and mother, but also maintained her own identity. She started a literacy program for adults in Ashton Falls, using her own experience of limited education to help others. She became an important voice in movements against child abuse, speaking at events and raising funds for protection organizations. As for Victoria, she remained in prison serving her sentence. She never showed genuine remorse, only resentment for being caught. Richard never spoke to her again, and the girls eventually processed their trauma in a way that allowed them to move forward without anger consuming them. On a particular evening, 5 years after that 7th birthday party, the family was gathered in the garden again. Sophia, Isabel and Amelia, now confident and happy pre-teens, were setting the table for an outdoor dinner that had become a weekly tradition. Clara was preparing everyone's favorite food, while Richard lit the candles that would decorate the table. As they sat down together, holding hands in a circle of gratitude before the meal, Richard looked at each face around the table. His 3 daughters who had survived unimaginable horror and emerged stronger, his wife who had chosen to love when it would have been easier to run, Mrs. Gable who had remained loyal through it all. This was his family, imperfect but real, built through adversity but held together by genuine love. And as they began to eat amidst laughter and lively conversation, Richard knew they had finally found what truly mattered. Not wealth or status, but each other, and the commitment to protect that precious connection above all else. The story that had begun with darkness and fear had found its end in light and hope, proving that even from the bleakest circumstances, courageous love can create lasting beauty. End of story.